What we're going to be doing is building the first application that we're going to be building in this course. And this application is going to be the backend application, and we will be building a front-end application to communicate with that backend application. But we're going to start with the backend application and build this thing out. And then once we're done, we're going to test it, and then we're going to build the front end to communicate with the backend. So I'm back in Visual Studio Code. And like I mentioned, what we're going to be working on right now is the backend application. And we're going to be building this using Node.js, and we're going to persist our data. And for this, we're going to be using the MySQL database server. And in the end, we're also going to be deploying this application. And to help us with this, we're going to be using Docker. So we're going to be doing a lot of interesting things here. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that I want to do, since I don't have a visual to show you of what we're going to be building in the end, because we're going to be building this together. So I don't have anything to show you as to the final product that we're going to be building. However, we have to talk a little bit about what exactly we're going to be doing. So I'm going to open a new file here, and that's just going to be like a text file or something. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing, just so you guys know exactly what's coming. So the backend application is going to be something called an API, which is application programming interface. So I'm going to say application programming interface. So an application programming interface, this is really kind of a broad concept because an interface is in so many different places. For example, your cell phone has an interface, which is the keyboard or the screen that you use to interact with the software or the underlying software. So that is an interface. So it's anything that allows you to connect to some application that you use to talk to another application or talk to some other technologies or talk to some other entity. And you can see here, if we look at this a little bit closer, it says application programming. So this is like technology stuff. And then the keyword here is interface. Interface here is made of two words, which is enter, which is in between, and then face, which is like a facade or the endpoint of something. So really what this means is that it's the endpoint that's going to allow something to be communicated with something else. But I want to make sure that I center this around, software development. So we're going to be focusing on that definition for just software development itself, which is, building API so that we can send requests to them and then interact with the API that way using HTTP protocol, which is like the most common way that, we build APIs and how we communicate with API. So we're going to be building that, which is going to be an application programming interface or an API or a Node backend application that you can communicate with using the HTTP protocol over the internet. So that's what we're going to be building. So some of the stuff we're going to need is we're going to be working with MySQL because we're going to be persisting our data. So this is going to be for data persistence. And we're going to also need to handle requests. So handle HTTP requests. And we need to handle CORS. So that's cross-origin resource sharing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. And we need to deal with something called SQL queries because we're going to need to write queries so that we can manipulate our data in the database. And then we're going to be using Docker. So Docker is going to come in the very end because that's what we're going to be using to just wrap up the application into a nice Docker image. And then we can run that image on any computer, which is going to make deployment a little bit easier for us. And this is really everything that comes up in my mind right now. There's probably more things that we're going to be doing that I can't really remember. But at a high level, we're going to be building NodeJs application. So let's make sure I put this at the top. So this is going to be a NodeJs app, and it's going to persist data using MySQL. We're going to be handling HTTP requests because it's an API. So it's going to be like a standalone application. And the way that we're going to be communicating with this application is by using the HTTP protocol. So we're going to be using the HTTP protocol, sending HTTP requests, etc., which is what I'm talking about on line 6. So handle HTTP requests. And another thing that comes to mind is routes. So we're going to be dealing with creating routes in the application, and we're going to need to create a database configuration. So configuration. And another thing is the controller. So we're going to be using the model view controller pattern. So we're going to be building a controller. And one last thing that comes to mind is something called error handling. Okay, because when you build an API, it's very important that you handle all your errors. So we're going to be doing that as well. So whenever we're done building this application and we run it and test it and everything, we should be able to test it in the browser, and we should be able to test it using Postman or any other HTTP client that you want. But we should be able to send requests with the proper data to the proper routes, and then we should be able to see the application in action. So that's everything that comes to mind right now. And of course, when we're going to be building this, everything that comes up, I will let you guys know. And that's what we're going to be doing. So, I mean, this is something that I'm just thinking about out loud. So we don't need to, put this anywhere. You don't need to copy this or anything like that. This is just me having a conversation with you about things that we're going to be dealing with when we're building this application. All right. So we have a lot to do. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm back in Visual Studio Code and I have my terminal open, and I've already navigated to the folder where I want to create the application, and I'm going to do mkdir to make a directory, and then I'm going to call it NodeJs API. Okay, so that's going to be the backend API. And then I'm going to go inside of this folder and clear the screen. So the first thing that I want to do is to start a node project, right? Because we need to manage our dependencies and we need to package that JSON file. And we can do this pretty easy. We can just do npm init, and then we can pass in a -y so that we can accept all the default. And what this is going to do is it's going to go ahead and give us all the default and create a package.json with no dependency whatsoever. So I'm going to press enter. And you can see that it gives us a snapshot of what it created, which is the package.json file. As you can see here, it created the package.json and it gave us, a little preview of what's inside of this file. So I'm going to go ahead and clear the screen again. And the second thing that I want to do is to do tsc. So I'm invoking the TypeScript compiler, and then I want to do --init. Okay, this is similar to what we just did, which is npm init, but this is for TypeScript compiler. And what this is going to do is it's going to generate a tsconfig file for us. So I'm going to go ahead and press enter again. And it says successfully created the tsconfig.json file. So I didn't talk much about this file when we were going over the different types in TypeScript and stuff. But now that we're going to be building an application, it's important that we take a closer look at this file. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So since I'm already navigated inside of this folder, I'm just going to do code that, and that's just going to open Visual Studio Code in this directory. And I'm going to go ahead and bring it over here because it's open in my other screen. Here's Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to expand it. So now you can see that I have the package.json with all the default. And then I have the ts.config file, and I'm gonna go ahead and collapse this for now. And now let's talk a little bit about this file. So there's a lot going on in this file. As you can see here, most of everything is commented out, right? That's because they know that most people won't be using all these configurations, but there is some configurations that we actually do need to do. So the first thing is we're gonna select the target, which you see here on line 7. And what that is the target version of JavaScript that we want to transpile our code to, or compile our code, because TypeScript doesn't run in the browser. In the end, we're gonna get JavaScript. So I'm gonna change this to ES6. Okay, so a newer version, not the newest version, but you can change it to whatever version you want, but I'm gonna stick with ES6. And what that means is that whenever it's gonna take all the TypeScript code, compile them, and then transpile them to JavaScript, then it's gonna do that using ES6 syntax or ES6 version of JavaScript. And we can leave module for CommonJS, and I'm gonna scroll down a little bit. This is also another very important one for TypeScript. So when you turn strict to true, then it's gonna turn, I think, all of these to true. Okay, so instead of doing every single one of these manually, which they think that most developers would want to have turned on, then they just created this other property here called strict. And once you set this to true, then it sets all these other ones to true. Okay, so we're gonna leave that, and if it's too strict, we can come back here and then uncomment some of these and then comment out what we don't want. But for now, I'm gonna keep this to true. I'm gonna scroll down a little more. Actually, I need to scroll up, and we need to enable these two properties. Okay, so the first one is the outdir. This outdir here is the directory that we can specify where all of the transpiled JavaScript files are gonna go. Okay, and for this, first I'm gonna uncomment this, and then let me make sure I keep the spacing the same. And here I want to specify a folder that I'm gonna create that I don't have yet, and I'm gonna call it this, which is short for distribution. And what this means is that whenever TypeScript is gonna take all the TypeScript code and then transpile it to JavaScript, then it's gonna look for this folder and then put everything in there. And make sure I keep the spacing the same. The second one we need to enable, actually I know I highlighted that one, but that's not the one. We need this other one, which is the root dir. This is specifying where the JavaScript files are located. So I'm going to go ahead and uncomment that. And then here, I'm going to put src, which is short for source. And what this means is that whenever TypeScript is going to look for files, the TypeScript files to transpile into JavaScript, then it's going to look into this src folder and takes everything in there. So even subfolders inside of the source folder, and it's going to transpile everything or compile everything to JavaScript. I think transpile is a better word, but you get the idea. It's going to take the TypeScript code, turn it into JavaScript code. So it's going to look inside of the root dir, which is going to be inside of the source. So everything inside of the source and every folder and subfolders inside of the source folder, take everything in there, all the TypeScript code in there, and then turn it into JavaScript code. And it's going to put that code inside of this or distribution folder. And that's pretty much everything that we have to do here. I have other projects, like larger projects, where I have a lot of these other properties turned on and turned off, but this is going to do for now because this file can be a little bit overwhelming because there's a lot of properties in here, but they're really pretty simple. Like if you look them up one by one, which is a little bit of a tedious task to do, you'll see that they're not really too crazy to understand. But for now, that's all we have to do. And again, you can change the target to whatever else you want, but I'm going to be sticking with ES6, our important folders. So where the source code is going to be and where the distribution or the production code is going to be or the JavaScript code is going to be. And then we're going to leave strict ES module interpro. We're going to leave that as the default as well. And you can see what this is doing here if you read this little comment that they have here. There's a couple things that we need to do in the package.json file. So let's go ahead and go through this file and make all of our changes. So the first one is the name. The name is fine with me. Version is fine. Description, we can put something here like NodeJs API with MySQL and Docker. Okay, so this is just a description. It doesn't really do anything. The main file is the index file, and I'm fine with that. So we're going to have to create this file at some point. And then for our script, so these are going to be the script that we're going to be using to run the application. And I'm gonna create the first one to start the, actually I'm gonna do start build. Okay, so we're gonna create a script that's gonna go ahead and build the application, and I'm gonna delete everything in there. And what I want to do is to call the TypeScript compiler. So I'm going to do tsc-p. Okay, so this stands for project. And then we have to give it the location of the configuration file where it's going to look at that file and then determine how to compile our application. And we're going to put a dot because the tsconfig file is in the same directory as the packet.json. So calling tsc-p, meaning compile the project. And then we're giving it the location of the tsconfig file, and it's going to look in there and then read over our configurations and then produce the JavaScript according to the configuration path that we're giving here by putting this dot in here, which means the same directory. So I'm going to create another one. I think I can do this little trick. Oh, there we go. All right, so I'm going to do two more. The second one is going to be for our dev development. So I'm going to put dev. And the last one is for the production build. So I'm going to do prod. Okay, so we're going to have three scripts, one to build a project, one to run our dev server, and another one to start our production server. So for the second one, what I'm going to do is to just call nodemon, because we're going to be installing nodemon as a dependency, and we want to do --exec. Okay, so it's really important that we do this. And then we want to exec ts-node. And we want to point to the index file. So I'm going to do src/index.ts. Okay, so that's going to be the name of the file. That's going to be the starting point of the application. And we want to also compile this file because it's TypeScript. So when you call tsnode, it's going to compile it to JavaScript and then run it, like do two commands all at once with tsnode. And we're going to install tsnode as well. If you don't want to do that, then you can, put something else here, like compile it and then run the JavaScript file. But I'm just going to go with this shortcut instead. And then for our production build, I'm going to do tsc-p again. So we're going to compile everything. And then I want to set a node environment. So I'm going to do node_env, and I'm going to set this equal to prod. Okay, so that's just a variable that I'm setting on the process in case I need to use it. And then I'm going to call node, and we want to point to the distribution folder, because you notice that we're calling tsc, which means we're going to compile all the code. So the code should be available, freshly available inside of the distribution folder or the dist folder. And that's why I'm pointing the node command inside of the distribution folder, because we already ran the tsc.compile, and then we're going to compile all the code. And we know that when this happens, we put in a configuration to put everything, if you scroll up a little, to put everything inside of the distribution folder or the dist folder. So that's why I'm pointing to this folder now, and then I'm looking for the same file. So that's going to be index.js. Remember, it's compile, so it's no longer ts, it's js. So we're going to run the compile.js file that's located inside of the distribution folder when we're going to run our application in production. So compile the code, and then we're going to run this command, which is going to set this variable on the process, and then run node and then point to the folder where we want to start the application. And then lastly, I can pass in my name here. And keyword, I guess we can put in some keywords, so feel free to do that. So that's what we're going to be doing for now. And next thing we have to do as far as this file is concerned is that we need to install all of our dependencies. And once we do that, then we're going to have another section here that's going to be like dev dependencies and then dependencies, where we're going to have a bunch of dependencies for the application. But for now, everything that we have here should be enough. So now let's go ahead and install the dependencies. Now let's go ahead and install all of the dependencies that we want. So I'm still in Visual Studio Code. You can see it in the back here. I just bring up the terminal, and then I'm going to install the dependencies using the npm. So npm install, we need course because we're going to be dealing with a front-end application, and we want the front-end application to be communicating with the back-end application. And there's a thing in browsers called cross-origin resource sharing, which is going to stop two different applications running on two different domains to communicate with each other unless the back-end application explicitly say, hey, this other app can talk to me. So we're gonna need course to take care of that. And then we need .env. .env is because we're going to be passing in some configuration. So when you have .env, then you can use a .env file where you can load that file up, like you load up the values in that file. And that's what we're going to put over all of our database configuration. So we need to be able to load this file into the node context so that node can read these properties or these parameters that we're going to put inside of this configuration file. And then we need express so that we don't have to build the server using regular node, which is going to be like really verbose. So we don't want to do that. So we're going to be using express, and I'm going to use another one called IP so that I can see the IP address of the server, but you don't need to put that one. You can just omit it if you want. And then we need the MySQL. I'm going to use the 2 version. So MySQL 2, make sure you specify that version as well. So not really a lot of dependencies, and the only ones that we really need are really the express and MySQL 2. But of course, if you're going to, be using this application with a friend application, then you're going to need course, and then .env for convenience, IP for convenience. So I'm going to press enter, and that's going to go ahead and install all these dependencies, and I'll come back when this is over. Oh, never mind, it's already over. And now if we can take a look at the package.json file, you can see that we have this dependencies property now, which is an object, and then we have all of our dependencies with whatever the latest version is. So now we have to install some type definitions because we're working with TypeScript, so we need to have code completion. And to do this, I'm gonna do up arrow key, and then I'm gonna do -d because those are dev dependencies, and I need to do at type /course for course, and I don't need to do it for .env. So we're gonna say type / actually this is supposed to be types, so let's make sure I change this. So types, and then express, and we also need to do the same here. So at types /IP, do it for MySQL. So at, and then we're gonna do types /MySQL, and then we're gonna need nodemon, so put that in there, and we need ts node, so ts-nodes, and then we're gonna do TypeScript as well. So TypeScript, I don't know why this is doing this, so let me clear the screen. Oh, there we go. So we're gonna do TypeScript as well because just in case that they don't have it. I need to delete this so I can understand what's going on here. So ts node space TypeScript, and then Control L. All right, I don't know where this is going. I think if I run it, it'll be fine because I typed it incorrectly, but I don't know why the command line is doing this. But anyway, we need to install those dev dependencies. So I'm gonna go ahead and press enter. All right, I'm gonna let this go. Hopefully it doesn't take too long. And I got an error here, and the error is for MySQL type. So I'm gonna go ahead and make this full screen because I want to see what's going on here. And then I think we need to change this to something else. So we have to say here, just types. So change this, and then MySQL 2. I don't think we have to put the at in the beginning of that. So let's go ahead and press enter and see what happens this time. All right, everything seems to work this time. So make sure you remove the at types in front of the MySQL 2 version whenever you're installing the dev dependencies. Otherwise, it's not going to work because it doesn't use the at, which is a little bit weird because everything else uses the at type. So they probably need to make this a standard. But anyways, all right, so let's go back to the package.json file and let's scroll down. So we know we have all of the actual dependencies that we need. So let's scroll down, make sure we have the types for course, the types for express, the types for IP, types for MySQL, MySQL 2, and then we have NodeMon, TS Node, and then TypeScript. So we have all of the dependencies that we need to build this application, and I think that's all we need to do for this file for now. So at this point, we should be ready to get started and then start building the application. And that would be another good time to take a break because we're gonna be actually coding and everything. So if you want to go grab a coffee or whatever, go ahead and do that and then come back and we're gonna continue. So I'm gonna go ahead and open the panel and I'm gonna collapse this. So we have all the files that we should have at this point. So the config file, the package.json, the package.lack.json, and then we have the node modules because it also installed all of these dependencies and dev dependencies that we have in the package.json file. So let's close everything here. So now what I want to do is to create the index file. So I'm gonna go here and then do index that let's do TS. Okay, so we have the index file and I also need to create the SRC folder. So I'm gonna do SRC. So remember, everything is gonna go inside of the SRC folder. So I'm gonna grab this and move it over to the SRC folder. Okay, so we're not gonna have everything hanging out here because we have configurations and node modules or whatnot. So we need to organize things a little bit, which is why we're putting this index file inside of this source folder because that's where all of the TS files are gonna go. So inside of this source folder. I'm not gonna go ahead and create the distribution folder or the this folder. So if we go back here, remember we have this folder that we're talking about here. When we compile everything for the first time, then this should be created. So I don't need to manually create it here, but feel free to do that if you want to. What I want to do just to test this out is to just put a console.log and then we're going to pass in a message here. And you know that message is going to be hello world. I'm gonna go ahead and just console log that just so we can test this out, so we can make sure that all the configurations are working. And that's also another reason I didn't create the distribution folder manually, because I want to see everything in action. So now if I run the so this script, so the build, it should go ahead and compile everything and then put the JS version of this index file inside of a new folder that's going to create, which is going to be the distribution folder. And inside of this folder, we should have the index.js that we're pointing to here, as you can see when we run the prod script. So I'm going to go ahead and bring back my terminal and I'm going to go ahead and clear the screen. So if I do npm run and then pass in the script name, so if I scroll down a little bit, you see the script that we want to run is the start build. So I'm going to go ahead and type start build. Okay, so this should go ahead and run this command and then build the project. Also make sure you're inside of your project because it's going to go ahead and look for, the TS config file, the JSON file, and it's not going to find it. So if I go ahead and run this, okay, so it looks like it ran successfully. And if you look over here, you can see that now we have the distribution folder. And if we look inside of it, we should see the index.js file, and you can see it right here using JavaScript instead of TypeScript. So we know that everything is working properly, and I can go ahead and get rid of this file altogether. I just wanted to demonstrate everything. So we know that our configuration is working. So now we can start working on the actual NodeJS application and build our server and then start coding. What I'm going to do now is create our node server. So we're going to start putting the server together so that we can see something when we check it out in the browser. And I want to take an object-oriented approach. And I think that's going to be very valuable to you because we actually look at a lot of those concepts in the course. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can take an object-oriented approach instead of having, a script file that's going to run from top to bottom. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and go to the source folder and then create a new file. And I'm just going to go ahead and call it app.ts. So app.ts. So that's going to be the main application file. So the index file is going to be where we're going to call the app and then run it. But the app itself is going to contain the actual application. So we're going to export a class. So I'm going to do export and then I'm going to say class and I'm going to call this app. Okay, so this is going to be the main application class. Inside of this class, I need to define a private and we can make it read only. So read only, and we're going to define it as app, and this is going to be of type application. Okay, so make sure we get application from Express. You can see it coming up here. And then I need a constructor, so I'm going to do constructor. So inside of the constructor, the only thing we really need is the port. So we want the user to give us a port, or we can pass in a default port if we don't get one from the user. So I'm going to say private. This can also be read only because we're not going to change this, so we're going to say port. I'm going to give this a union type, so I'm going to put parentheses, and then this can be a string or it can be a number. So I'm going to pass string or a number. We're going to set this equal to the process. So we're going to access the process.env.server port. Okay, so this server port doesn't exist. And if it's not set at any given point in time, whenever we're going to start the application, then it's going to be undefined. But I'm just going to set it anyway, because the user might be able to pass something, which is the port, which is super important for the application, because sometimes we want the application to run on different ports depending on the environment or whatever the case might be, or maybe we're testing something, or maybe we want to run different instances of the application, so we might want to be able to pass the port. So I'm going to do Control B to collapse this panel. So we're going to get the port from the process. So if you don't get the port from the process, then we're going to pass in 3000. So the port can be a string, it can also be a number, and we're going to get it from the user. You see, whenever they call the app constructor, they can pass in the port, or they don't have to pass it at all. They can pass it in the process, because that's the second place that we're going to be looking, or we can just set it to 3000. And this 3000 is really just arbitrary, so you can change it to whatever number you want. So now I'm going to say this lowercase. So I'm going to call the app and then call express. So I'm going to say express and call the function. And we also need to import that. So I'm going to go up here. So it's supposed to come from the same package. And then I'm going to say express, put a comma. So we're going to import express and also application. So we're just grabbing application, so not everything else. That's why it's in curly braces. All of this is coming from express. And I need to pass some other stuff. So I'm going to say this, that middleware. So this is going to be a function that I'm going to create. So we don't have this function yet. And then I'm going to pass in some routes. So this dot routes. And this is also a function, doesn't take any parameters. And now we need to create those. So I'm going to come here, quick fix, declare methods, and then come here, declare that as well, quick fix, declare. Gonna put some space here. So one other very important method that we need is the listen. So I'm going to go down here and then I'm going to create this listen. So the listen is going to be a public method, because we need to be able to call it outside of the class. And it's not going to take any parameters, and it's going to return void. So we're going to say void. And the only thing we have to do is to call the app.listen. So we're going to say this.app, and then we're going to call the listen. So that's the listen coming from Express. We're just creating our own listen here. And then here, we just need to pass in the port. So we're going to say this.port. Okay, so because we're taking the port as private, so it's like we have it at the class level, like defined as a property on the class. So that's why we can access it using the this keyword. So we're going to give it the port, and then we can say, just pass in a message so that we know something is going on. So we're going to say console that, let's do info. And then in here, I'm going to put backtick, and then I'm going to say this application. I'm going to define this application underscore running. So that's going to be like a string that we're going to define. And then I can pass in the IP address. So I'm going to put another $, open and close curly braces. And then I'm going to say IP, lowercase IP, and then address. And that's a function. So opening and close parentheses. And then we can pass in the port. So I'm going to put a colon and then pass in the port. So I'm going to do the same thing. So $, open and close curly braces, and then call the port, which is this.port. Okay, so we're going to pass in a message so that we know that the application is running. We need to import this. It's not letting me importing it. So let's just create this first. So declare property, yes. And we want this to be a private read-only as well. So I'm going to copy this and paste it here. So private, read-only, application running, and I'm just going to set this to a string. So here I'm just going to say application is running on, and then put a colon, and I need to put the equal sign here. So this is going to be like application is running on IP address and then port. So we just concatenate everything here. And then now I need to import the IP, which is a package that we brought in. So I'm going to come up here, and then I can actually duplicate this line. So I can do this coming from IP, and we just need to import IP. So I'm going to delete all this and then pass in IP. So we're getting IP from the IP, and then we're calling the address, which is going to give us the IP address of the server where this is running. Now let's go down a little. So now we need to work on the middleware and the routes. So these methods, they're going to be private because we don't want them to be able to be called outside of the class. So I'm going to do private middleware, and of course they're not going to return anything. So I'm going to put void. So here what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say this .app.use, because that's how you pass in middleware. And then the first one that I need to use is course, because I want this to be able to be accessed by other application. And then the course will take a configuration, and I'm just going to say, let's do origin, and then we're going to put just a star. Okay, because We just want everyone to be able to access this. Now, if you were building something like for real, that's going to go in production, like a real world application, like something that's actually going to be used by a real user in the real world, then you would probably want to change this to something specific. You wouldn't open it up like this to the entire world, because that's just a security vulnerability. So you would probably have a list here, or use the course configuration to pass in all of the front end application or all the applications that are allowed to call this backend application. But you would probably never do something like this in real life. And now, of course, we need to import course. Oh, I got a quick fix here. So import course from course. Let's see. Okay, so that looks good. All right, so I was able to import that. So we're going to pass in this middleware, which is course, and we're saying, hey, any other application can talk to this backend application. And another one that I need to pass is the JSON, because we're going to be working with JSON. So this app.use, and then we're going to pass in express.json, and that's a method call. So we're going to put opening and close parenthesis, and then close that with a semicolon. And then I'm going to put a space here. Also, this is a private one, so we're going to say private. And just to talk a little bit more about this JSON, this is how we're gonna be able to take information coming from incoming requests that are in JSON format. So because we have this, then we'll be able to access information from incoming requests that comes in JSON format. And now this is also gonna return void. So we're gonna say void, and then we're gonna pass in all of the routes that we want the application to use. So again, we're gonna say this app and then use, and then here I want to pass in all of my patient route. So I'm gonna say /patients. So this is going to be all the patients route. And then since I don't have those routes yet, so I'm just going to take the callback function. So to do this, I'm going to do request and then response, and then we're going to call the callback function. But for now, it's not going to do anything. So callback function, and then opening and close curly braces. So we don't do anything. So we have the callback function, but it doesn't do anything. I'm gonna scroll up a little so you guys can see, and I'm gonna go ahead and just duplicate this line 2 times. So the second one is gonna be for a get. So this is gonna be a get request, and that's just gonna go to /. So if we go to / in the application, so we don't go to anything, we just go to the root, like something.com. So that's like the /. Then we're just gonna send some response. And this, I'm gonna put it on one line, so we don't need the curly braces. So what I'm going to do is just say for the response that send a status, and I want this to be 200. So we're going to let them know that everything is okay. So 200. And then I'm going to call that send so that we can send some data. So for the send, we're just going to send in some JSON data for now. So opening and close curly braces. Let's do something like message colon, and then we're going to say something like server is up. Okay, so we're gonna come back later and change this message, but just so that whenever we go to the application and we go to just /, then we get something, you know, coming back to us so that we know that the application is running. And then for the last one, I'm gonna change the use to all, and this is just like a default. So everything else that's not /patient, that's not / just like /, we're just gonna take it here. And for this, I'm gonna put an asterisk, and what that means is that I'm gonna access everything, every URL that we don't find, which is every URL that's not patients or /. Then they all gonna come here. And what we need to do for this is just send something similar. So I'm gonna copy this whole thing and then come back here, remove the curly braces because I'm not gonna have multiple lines, and then paste that in. I'm gonna pass in here 404 because that's the not found. And then for the message, so I'm gonna change this, and I'm just gonna create a message. So I'm gonna say this that route underscore not underscore found. Of course, we don't have this parameter yet, so we're gonna go ahead and create it. All right, so this is gonna be our routes. So the first one is /patients. So everything that goes to /patients, we're gonna pass in here our middleware, which is gonna be the patient routes. And then the second one is for a get request to just /, and we're just gonna send them this response, say, hey, everything is good. And then for everything else that's not /patients or just /, then they're gonna come here, and we're just going to tell them, hey, this route was not found on the server, and then we send them a 404. So let's scroll up here and let's change this. So this is also going to be a read-only, so I'm going to copy this, paste it in here, and we're going to change this to a string. So I'm going to change all this, and we're just going to say something really simple, and I'm just going to say route does not exist on the server. Okay, so we're just telling them that, we didn't recognize this route. It's not on our server. So now you can see that whenever we create an instance of this class, whenever we call this constructor, it's going to do everything and call the middleware and also call the routes. So we will have everything that we need just by calling the constructor, because you can see that inside of the constructor, we're passing in our middleware and we're also passing in our routes, which is these two methods down here. And they're private because we don't want them to be accessed outside of the class, which means whenever you create an instance of the class, then you won't be able to call these methods, but you will be able to call the listen, because you want to call this app.listen so that you can start the Node/Express application. So this looks fine for now. And now we can use this class to run the entire application. And we're going to do that in the index file. So in the index file, just going to delete this. And what I want to do is to just create another function or another method. So I'm going to do const, and we can call it start. We can also call it something like init. You can also call it something like run. But in my case, I'm just going to go ahead and call it start. But I'm just letting you know that you can call it whatever you want. And I want this to be an arrow function. Doesn't take any parameter. It's also going to return void. And what we want to do is to just call the constructor so that we can run the application. So in there, we're going to say, create another constant called app, and then we're going to set it equal to new, and then we call the application that we just create. So we're going to say new app. And then here, if we want, we can pass in a port, or we don't have to pass in a port. And it's going to look in the process to see if the server port is there. If the server port is not set, then it's going to be undefined, so it's not going to use it. Then it's going to go to 3000. So if I go back real quick just to refresh your memory, you can see here, if we pass in a port, then it's going to use that port. If we don't, then it's going to set it equal to either the server port, if it's there. If it's not there, it's going to be undefined, then it's going to do 3000. So now let's go back here. We just have to call the listen. So here we're going to say app.listen, and then open and close. The only thing we have left, we just created this function. You can see it's a little bit dim. And if I put my cursor over it, you can see that it's not being called. So we just defined this function, but we didn't call it. So then I'm going to come down here and then call start, open and close, semicolon. So now whenever I run the application, if I go to the JSON file, when we run the script, which is pointing to the index file, you can see here, then it's going to go ahead and say, okay, so we're going to do all this and then call the listen. And then now we're just going to call this function or this method that we just create. And when we call this, then it's going to create a new app or a new instance of the app, which is going to go in there and then do all this, which is going to do all of this and all this. So this is the object-oriented approach that I wanted to take. But of course, you can change this if you want or take a different approach. But I feel like this would help you put in practice some of the stuff that we learned in terms of object-oriented programming. So let's close this for now and let's go back here. So everything looks good. You can see that everything looks clear. We don't have any errors. So now we just have to test this. So I'm going to go ahead and open my terminal and we're just going to run the script again. So we're going to say npm run, and then we want to do start dev. Okay, so once we do this, then the dev server should start. So I'm going to press enter. All right, you can see it's executing everything and you can see that it's running. So application is running on my IP address and then on 3000. So you can see that it takes 3000 because we didn't set the server port on the process. But if we had done that, then it would have taken the whatever we set for the server port. But now it's using 3000 because that's the default if we don't pass anything. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and then open it in my browser. And I'm going to drag the browser over and make it full screen. And you can see that it says server up. So whenever we go to the // then it goes to the server up message. Now, if we come in here and we do / and then we pass in some random characters. So let me do something like, just some gibberish, and then press enter. You can see it says that the route does not exist on the server. So everything seems to be working. And if we go to /patient, I don't think anything is going to happen, but I just want to see what's going to happen. You see that nothing happens. Okay, this route is not working yet, but we're going to make it work in a second. Well, it's actually working because it's still loading. Okay, so you see that it keeps loading because we didn't return anything. Like we didn't use the send to send anything, so it's stuck. All right, so I'm gonna cancel this and then go back to the root. All right, server up. So our server is up and everything seems to be working. The configuration that we put in is working. Now what we need to do is to work on this patient routes. Okay, so you see that we're not doing anything here. So the biggest part of the application is going to be in here. So in this line where we're going to pass in the routes for the patient routes. So that's going to be like get all the patient, create a patient, update a patient, and delete a patient. So that's going to be here. All right, so let's go ahead and continue. So before we go any further, one thing I do want to do, if we go back to the app class, I want to not have to put in these numbers like in there like that. I want to be able to create some class and some enum so that I can use them instead. And that's going to be less error prone. And I just want to be able to send a standard response every time there's a request that comes into the application. So every single time the response is always going to be looking the same. Like the object is going to be the same every single time. So I'm not going to be working on the patient routes yet. We're going to just put the foundations that we need. And then we're going to work on this, which is going to be like the biggest part of the application. But let's take care of this HTTP response that I need to be able to send every time there's a request that comes into the application so that we can build our API so that all the responses, they all look the same, have the same message and the timestamp and everything. So to do this, I'm going to create another class. So inside of the source folder, we're going to create another folder and I'm going to call it domain. You can call this something else, but in my case, I'm just going to call it domain. And then in here, I'm just going to create a class and I'm going to call it response. So here, I'm going to say response.ts. So that's going to be the class that's going to represent the response. I'm going to create a class. So I'm going to say export class. And I'm going to call it HTTP response, open and close curly braces. And I need the timestamp. So I'm going to do private timestamp. So timestamp. And this is going to be of type string. Okay, so that's the only property that we're going to need on the class. And then we're going to call the constructor. And inside of the constructor, we need a private, that's going to be status code. Okay, so that's going to be like the 200 or whatever. And this is going to come from code. So we're going to create another enum that we're going to call code. Oops. And then we're going to import it inside of this class. We're going to need another private. That's going to be the HTTP status. Okay, so that's going to be like OK, internal server error, not found or something like that. And this is going to come from another enum that I'm going to call status. And then I want to have a message. So I'm going to say private. But before I do, let's collapse this so that we can see what's going on here. So we're going to say private and we're going to pass in a message. That's going to be of type string. And then lastly, we're going to have another private and that's going to be the data. Now the data is going to be optional because sometimes we're sending, a response back, but we don't have any data. So I'm going to put a question mark and then the data is going to be some kind of object. So I'm going to put opening and close curly braces. And then now inside of the constructor, I just have to set those. So I'm going to do this dot timestamp and then set it equal to a new date. So the JavaScript date. We're calling the constructor, and then just to make this look a little better, we're gonna say to local string. That's just gonna make it a little bit more human readable. And then I need to pass in the status code. So this that status code, and then set it equal to status code. So whatever we get in the constructor, this that HTTP status, we're gonna set it equal to the HTTP status, and then we have to do the same for the message. So this that message, set it equal to the message. And then the data. So this dot data, set it equal to the data. Okay, so now you see that we're clearly getting an error from the code and the status. So we're gonna go ahead and create this enum in a minute, but there's one thing I wanna point out. So this timestamp, we're not getting it from the constructor because we don't need to, because we can always create it on the fly like this, because we just need to get the time on the system. So every time we're gonna send a response, we don't need to ask the user to pass us the timestamp. We can create it ourselves. So that's why I define this up here and then I pass it in up here. So now let's go ahead and define the code and the status. So to do this, I'm gonna go ahead and create another folder. So I'm gonna go inside of the source. So everything from now on gonna go inside of the source. Okay, so you see that the domain is inside of the source, and I'm only gonna have these two files hanging out there inside of the source, but everything is gonna be inside of the source because that's where all of the files should be, so that TypeScript can compile everything and then put them into this folder. So inside of the source folder, I'm gonna create another folder, and I'm just gonna go ahead and call it enum. Inside of there, I'm gonna create a file. I'm gonna call it code.enum.ts. And then I'm gonna create another one. So inside of the enum again, that's gonna be the status.enum.ts. Okay, so those are the two files. So let's go ahead and work on the code first. So for the code, if I can collapse this, what we're going to do is pretty simple. So export enum, and we're gonna call it code, open and close, and then here we just have to set all the main HTTP code. So OK, which we're gonna set to 200, and then we need not found, so not underscore found. This is gonna be set to 404, and then we need the bad request. So that's a very popular one. So bad request, and we're gonna set this to 400, and you can look up those codes. So I'm just putting down the ones that I know that I'm going to be using, and they're like the most commons. And then we have created, and that's going to be 201. And then the last one I want to have in there is internal underscore server underscore error. And this is of course 500. So those are the main ones that I'm going to need. And you can come back here and put more if you want to use more like other HTTP status code, but those will do for what we're doing. But this way you can just come in here, add more, and then use them in your application. So they're all in a centralized way. So a little bit better in terms of organization. And then in the status, we're going to be doing something similar. So let me see if I can copy all this and then come in here. Well, actually, I'm going to copy the whole thing. Come in here and then paste it. And we're just going to change this to status. So status, status. And this is actually going to be the same. So I'm going to come here and then change this to, I want to use single quote. So that's going to be okay. And we're going to do the same for the rest of them. So copy this, come in here, put a single quote, and then paste. When I was first working on this, I wanted to combine these. You can see that they're really similar, but then I keep going back and forth and then back and forth and then back and forth. And then in the end, I was like, okay, all right, I'm just going to keep them separate. But if you want, you can combine them. You can see that they're probably should be combined, but I don't know. I just didn't feel like I should combine them. But you can probably combine them into one object, which is what I had, like HTTP status. And then they will have a status and a code. But I'm just creating two enums. That doesn't bother me. So now in here, we can just import these. So I'm going to come here, quick fix, import, come here, import. All right, so everything now looks good. We can use this class instead and then send response whenever we are sending response back to the application instead of, passing in something here like manually like we're doing here. So we're going to use instead this class. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and then go back here. And also before I go back, you see that I'm creating a constructor. So that means we can call the constructor on this and then pass in this information. So let's go back to the app. I can close this because we don't need it anymore. And then here, instead of 200, I can call code. That's coming from our enum and then pass in OK, because we know the OK is a 200, which is a number. And then for the send, instead of passing in an object that we create on the fly, we're just going to call our constructor. So we're going to say new HTTP response. And then in here, we can pass in everything that we need to pass. So the first one is going to be the code, and that's going to be OK. The second one is going to be the status. So we're going to say status. So that should come from our enum. And then this is going to be OK again. And then we can pass in the message. So the message is going to be something like, welcome to the Patients API, and let's do version, let's say 1.0. I'm gonna keep this on one line because I like when things are on one line, but feel free to put this on another line. Just put things however you like. And then now we need to import this, so let's go ahead and import it. All right, so now this looks a lot better. We can clearly read this and we know what it's doing. We can see that this is a code, which is okay. We can see that this is a status, which is the okay status. So let's just copy, well, we can't copy this. So let's change this to the not found. So we're gonna say code dot not found. And then we're gonna do the same here. So I'm gonna copy this whole thing. And then instead of passing in this object that we're creating, I'm just going to pass in the HTTP response, and we need to change this to not found. So not found here, I'm going to select both of them and then paste. So that's the not found, and the message is going to be the same message. So I'm going to remove this message and then pass in the this dot not found. Okay, so that's the message, the same message. So now everything looks a lot better. And again, feel free to put those on new lines if you want to, but for now, I'm just going to keep them on the same line. That's just my preference. But you can see that they're going off the screen. So feel free to put things on a new line. Another thing I want to point out is, as you can see that in the response that we're sending, we're not doing anything with the request here. And you can see that VS Code is giving us a little bit of a warning. You can see that it's a little bit dim, and you can see that it says it's declared, but it's never used. If you want to get rid of this problem, you can put an underscore here, and that's going to solve it. And what that means is that you're saying, hey, I actually know that I'm getting this, but I'm not using it, so don't worry about it. So you put an underscore, and I can do the same as well here. So you can put an underscore here, and you can see that it looks a lot better. Well, I don't know if it looks better, but you get rid of the little warning. Say, hey, this is defined, but it's never used. So this is you saying, hey, I know I'm getting this, but I'm not using it. So I'm going to put this underscore here just to let you know that I'm aware. So I'm going to undo that, but I just wanted you to know that you can do this. So now if I bring back my terminal, you can see that the application restarted because of all the changes we were doing. But just to be safe, I'm going to do Control C and then say yes on that, clear the screen, and then just run the script again. All right, everything is working. Okay, so we're live. and then I'm gonna bring the browser again. All right, so if I go ahead and refresh this, the message should look a lot different. So let's go ahead and refresh. You can see now we have a status code, we have the HTTP status of 200, and then we have the message, and then we have a timestamp. So that looks a lot better. That looks more like an API. And then if we go to / and then we go to some random string that doesn't exist or some route that doesn't exist and press enter, you can see now we get a 44, and that's just route does not exist on the server, timestamp, HTTP status code, and the HTTP status. So that looks a lot better. So now let's collapse this and this. So now we can focus on working on this this part here, which is going to be all the routes for all the patients, which is where we're going to create all the CRUD operations. So create, update, read, and delete. All right, so let's go ahead and work on the patient routes. So I'm going to create another folder. So inside of the source folder again, I'm going to go here, click on another folder, and I'm just going to call it routes. And then inside of here, we're going to create the patient routes file. So I'm going to create a file, and then I'm going to call it patient.route. Let's do routes.ts. Okay, so this is where all the routes are going to go. And then in here, we need to import the router from Express. So we're going to say router, and this is coming from Express. So from Express. Okay, so now we have the router from Express, then we can create our object. So we're going to say constant, and I'm going to call it patient routes, and then set it equal to the router. So router. All right, so that's what we have to do for now. And then of course we have to export this. We're going to say export default, and then the patient routes. So we can export this. Obviously this is not doing anything for now. We're just creating the router and then exporting it, but everything is going to come in between here. But I just want to make sure that we can pass this route in. So let's copy this, go back to the app, collapse this, and then we're going to change all this to the patient route. Okay, so that's going to be used as a middleware. And of course, we need to import this, so make sure it's coming from the right location. So that's all the patient routes that we need, and everything is going to go to /patient. So everything that's going to be inside of this route, they're going to be prefixed with /patients, because that's what we're passing in here. And then everything's going to go to the patient routes. So now what we need to do is we need to create a controller, which we're going to be calling in here, which is going to create all the functions that we need to do all the operations that we need, which is, create, update, and delete, and all that stuff in a database. So all of this is going to come in between here, and then we're going to export everything here, and then we're going to tell our application to use it as a middleware, as you can see that I'm putting here. We could have put this here as well, it doesn't matter, but since I call this function route, that I'm passing in the routes here. So let's go back here, and then the first thing that I want to do is to create a controller, because we're going to be calling the controller inside of the patient routes. So I'm going to create another folder again just to keep things organized, and I'm going to call it controller. Okay, so that's going to contain the controller for the routes, and that's where all the main functions are going to be. But whenever we're going to create the controller and create those functions will need to call the database, and we don't have a database connection yet. So before we work on the controller, we actually need to work on the database configuration. So let's create another folder. So come here, create another folder. I'm going to call it config. Okay, so that's going to contain our configuration. And then in here, I'm going to create the MySQL configuration. So I'm going to create a file, and then I'm going to say mysql.config.ts. By the way, I'm just using this naming convention, but you can use any other naming convention that you want. You don't have to be stuck with this one. So what we're going to do in here is we're going to put the database configuration, and then inside of the controller, actually we can also create this file right now just so that can make more sense. So we're going to say patient.controller.ts. That's the controller. So the patient controller is going to contain the method to create the patient, get all the patient, update a patient, and delete a patient. But to do this, it needs to talk to the database. So we need to have a database configuration. Now this can go in the same file, but I'm going to put it in a separate file, which is going to be this mysql.config.ts file. So the database configuration is going to go in here, and then we're going to call it in here, and then create all the functions, and those functions are going to be exported in the route. So we're going to call those functions in the route here. So that's what we're going to be doing, and then build our application. So let's go inside of the MySQL config file, and I'm going to close everything else. So close others, and then collapse this panel. So in here, we need to import a few things. So I'm going to import the create pool. So I'm going to do create and then pool. So that's coming from the MySQL dependencies that we put in, and I'm going to make this come from MySQL2/promise. So we're going to say promise, and that's supposed to be MySQL2. Okay, so make sure you get this right. So MySQL 2, which is the version that we install, and then we need this to come from the promise. And then I need to import .env. So I'm going to call it .env, and this is supposed to come from .env. Okay, so that's gonna help us load any configuration file. So any .env file that we have, which is where we're gonna put in all the database configuration. So then I'm gonna come here and then say .env.config so that everything can be loaded. And then now I can start working on our database connection. So what I'm gonna do is export a new constant, and I'm gonna call it connection. So that's going to be the name of the constant that we're going to be exporting. Well, it's a function, and it's an error function, and it's also asynchronous. So we're going to say async. And the reason for this is because the create pool returns a promise. As you can see from the import, it's giving you a hint that this is going to return some kind of promise. So in here, we're going to pass in the parameters of the function. So nothing. And then we're going to call the callback function. And you can use regular function if you guys want to. I just think that, you know, using error function is a little bit nicer and more elegant. And then in here, I'm going to create another constant. So I'm going to say const, and I'm going to call it pool. Now, the reason I'm creating a pool instead of connection, a pool is a little bit more performant. And in here, we're going to use the await keyword. So we're going to say await, and then call the create pool. So we're going to say create pool. And of course, that takes some parameters. So in here, we're going to pass in all the parameters that we need to pass. So it's an object, so opening and close curly braces. The first one is the host. I'm going to call the process.env, and then let's do something like db_host. Okay, so we're going to set this in the process. Of course, we don't have any of this yet. I'm just setting things up. And then we can pass in the user. So user is going to be again from the process.env.dbuser. So we're going to say db_user. And then we need the password. So we're going to say password, lowercase password, again coming from the process.env.db password. So db_password. And then the next one is the database to connect to. So we're going to say database. And this is, of course, coming from, again, the process.env. Let's do db_name. So that's the database name. So that's why I name it that. And then we need the port. So the port for the database, by default, MySQL is 3306. So I'm going to pass this as default. Or if they pass in something in the process, then we can get it as well. So process.env again, and then we're going to create another one called db port. _port. And then the connection limit. So here I'm going to say connection limit. You can see it coming here. And again, set this to say 10. And if we don't pass anything, so I'm going to put or process.env, and let's just call this db_connection_limit. And then now what we can do is to just return that pool. So we're going to say return the pool. So everything in this configuration is pretty straightforward. So, you know, the host, the user, the password, the database name to connect to, the port, and the connection limit. And I can put my mouse over this. You can see the description. It's the maximum connection that it's going to create at once. It's going to create 10 open connections at once. And then every time there is like a request to connect to the database, then there's a pool that the application can connect to and then grab one of the 10. So we don't have a big load in the application. It's a simple application. Well, the load is going to depend on the usage of the application. But again, this is just a demo app, but this is going to be very important to determine if your app is going into production. But I'm going to go with the connection limit of 10, but feel free to change it if you would like. So this is the database configuration. Now we can use this configuration in the controller and then call the connection. And then once we get a connection, then we can do all the querying of the database. So let's close this for now and let's go back here. One last thing we need to do before we can actually work on the controller is to define all of the queries. And the reason that I like to do this is because I don't like to put the queries inside of the controller functions themselves, because it looks really messy when you have all these strings inside of these functions. So I like to keep all my database queries separate. To do this, again, we're going to create another folder. So collapse everything. And then inside of the source folder, I'm going to create another folder. I'm going to call it query. And then inside of this, I'm going to create another file and I'm going to call it patient.query.ts. Okay, so all the queries regarding patients are going to go inside of this file. And I'm going to go ahead and collapse this, and we need to export a constant, and I'm gonna put it in uppercase because it looks nicer when it's uppercase. And this is really just an object, so open and close. And then in here, what I want to do is to just pass in some property and then some string. So the properties are gonna be the name of the query, and then the string, which is the value, is gonna be the actual query. So in here, we can say select underscore patients. That's the select patients query, and it's gonna equal select star from the patients table. We can do order by, and let's do created at, so we can order everything by the date that they were entered, but we want it to be descending. So the newest one will be on top, and let's get the first 50, for example. We're gonna say 50. So this is the select query. Whenever I'm inside of the controller, I can just call this select patient query, and then it's gonna give me this string instead of having to, type in this string, which would be a little bit cumbersome inside of the function itself. I just don't like to do that. So I'm gonna duplicate this line a few times. And then the second one is select patient. So I'm gonna remove the S in this, and then it's gonna be select star from patient, and we need a where clause. So here I'm gonna change this to where and ID equal question mark. So we're going to pass this in dynamically. We're just going to grab that one patient where the ID equals whatever the ID is. We could also use the email here because we know that the email is always going to be unique. Feel free to do that. I'm just going to go with the ID here. And then I'm going to change this to create patient. So I'm going to change this string to create patient. So that's remove the S. And this is going to be an insert statement. So I'm going to remove everything in here. And then I'm going to say insert into, and then the patients table. So patients. And then we're going to pass in the key and then the value. So keys and values. So the keys are going to be first name. So first underscore name. And then last underscore name. And then the email. We need the address. We need the diagnosis. We need the phone, and we need the status. So the patient status, like hospitalized or pending or active or whatever. And then we need the image URL. So we're going to say image underscore URL. Okay, so again, feel free to put this on a no line, but I'm going to keep it on one line. And then we have to pass in the values. So we're going to say values, and make sure this is the same string. So let me scroll over. So we don't need this here. Let me move this over so that it can look better. Scroll over. So you can see we're doing the insert into patients, first name, last name, email, address, diagnosis, phone, status, and then the image URL. So now we need to get the actual value. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so we're gonna pass in a value for this, but they're gonna be dynamic, so put a question mark. So the same number of keys that we have here, we have to pass in the same number of question marks here. Okay, so make sure you get that right, and then we can work on the next one. So the next one is going to be update patient. So I'm gonna select this and then change it to update patient and remove the S at the end of that. So this is to update the patient, and I'm gonna change everything in here, and this is gonna be an update statement. So update the table patients, and then we want to say set, and then we pass in the keys again. So I'm gonna copy everything in here, just right there. So at the end of image URL, and come back here, scroll over, and then paste everything in here. So we're gonna set the first name equal to question mark, because this is gonna be passed dynamically. And then I'm gonna copy this, including this space, and then I'm gonna keep pasting in here. So paste here, 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 scroll over, paste it here, 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 and here. And then lastly, we need to pass in the ID or the where clause. So we're gonna say where ID equal another question mark. We need to know which patient we're updating these for, whatever the ID is for the ID that they're gonna give us. So whenever they're doing an update, they're not only gonna give us the information to update, so the first name, last name, email, etc. They should also give us the ID of the patient that they need to update. And then lastly is to delete a patient. So I'm gonna change this select again to delete, and remove the S in the end. And then we're just gonna delete that patient from the table. So I'm gonna change everything in here, delete, and I need this clause, so this where clause. I'm gonna copy it and paste it in here. And then I just need to do delete from, pass in the table, so patients where ID equal whatever the ID that we're gonna pass, and we can get rid of this last comma. So this is our CRUD operation. You can see here, this is the to read, create, update, and then delete. Okay, so of course you can do more operations, but all operations really boil down to these 4 operations, which is the CRUD operations. Now we can just import this query inside of the controller and then import the connection and then work on our functions there. Let's go over to the controller file. So inside of the controller folder, we're going to open the patient controller.ts. And now we can go ahead and start working on some of the functions that we need to work on. So let's do export. And we're going to export a constant, and this is going to be get patients, and it's going to be asynchronous. So I'm going to say async, and it's going to accept the request and the response. So we're going to say request, which is going to be of type request. That's supposed to come from Express, and then we're going to have the response, and that's also going to be of type response, also coming from Express. And let's just go ahead and import this now. So I'm going to say import, and we're going to say let's just destructure all these. So requests, and then response, so response. And we probably should do the same in the main application file. Now that I remember that, let's copy these and let's go to the main app file and scroll up, expand this. Let's just put this, this is gonna be a mess, but I'm gonna delete everything. So we're gonna get the response and the request as well. So remove the import. All right, so we have the request and the response. So now we can type the request and the response properly. So let's go down here and then we're gonna type those. So here we're gonna say this is gonna be of type request, and this one as well, and then get the response. So this response right here, we can come here and put the type. It's important we do this because that's the whole point of using TypeScript. We don't want to leave things to any type. We want things to have their type so that we can enforce our application and then have it less error prone. Okay, so we can close this for now. So we're gonna get these, and then this is gonna return a promise. So I'm gonna say promise. So that's an interface. And then in here, we're gonna pass in the response. And this response is gonna contain some patient because we're trying to get a lot of patients. This is the get patients. So we're gonna send a request to return a list or an array of patients. So in here, I'm gonna pass in patient. And that's an interface, and I don't have it yet, but we're gonna go ahead and create it real quick. And that's an array. So I'm gonna put opening and closing bracket and then close the promise. And then now we can have the arrow function. And then in here, that's where everything is gonna go. So inside of there, that's where we're gonna put all the logic and everything to get the patients and then return them to the caller of the application. But before we continue, let's make sure we take care of this error right here because we don't have this patient. So let's go over here and let's create another folder. And that's gonna be the interface folder because we need to create an interface. So interface, so everything we learn in the course, just putting everything in practice. And then inside of the interface folder, I'm gonna create another folder. I'm gonna call it patient.ts. That's going to be the interface. And then we're going to fill this in real quick. So export interface, and it's going to be patient and open and close. Oops, open and close. And we have an ID. That's going to be a number. We have first name. So first, actually, I think I can copy some of this stuff from the query. So let's copy from here. So copy all this and close this, close the panel. And I'm just going to paste everything here, and then we can arrange things where they need to be. So the first name is gonna be a string, and then new line, the last name also gonna be a string. I think everything in here is gonna be a string, so I'm gonna go ahead and copy this line and then paste it here just so we can save time. So string, and then remove this, oops, email, another string, address is also a string, diagnosis also a string, the phone is also a string, the status is a string, and then the image URL also a string. Okay, so first name, last name, everything that we have in the queries. So that's the patient interface. So now we can close this and then import this guy right here. So let's go ahead and do this and then import. Okay, so it's giving us an error because we're not returning anything yet, but we're gonna go ahead and work on that right now. So the first thing I wanna do is to log something to the console. So let's do console log. Actually, let's do console info. So info. And then we're gonna pass in some information about the request just so that we can see something. Oops, that's supposed to be info. Just so we can see something in the console whenever there's a request that comes into the application. So I'm gonna do a lot of concatenation. So I'm gonna pass in backtick. I wanna pass in a timestamp. So I'm gonna put some bracket here just so we can distinguish the timestamp and the rest of the log. So here I'm gonna pass in $, opening and close. And I'm just gonna call in the new date. So we're gonna say new date and then call the constructor. And then do to local string again, and then close that. And then after we pass in the timestamp, we can say incoming, and then we can access some of the information from the request. So $, oops, opening and close. And then we're going to access some of the request information. The first thing is the method. So I'm going to say request method so that we know what kind of request they're sending. And I'm just going to copy this and paste it 2 times. Oops, Control Z. And here we need to access the original URL. So I'm going to say original URL. And then I'm going to put in here requests and from. And then here we can access the host. So whoever is sending the request to us, if you want to be able to see it, then we can access all of this information from the request as well. And to do this, I'm gonna paste this again. And this time, when we get inside of the request, we need to access the raw headers. Inside of the raw headers, the first item is gonna be the host. And then the second one, I'm gonna copy all this, put a space and then paste and put a 1 here. The first item is going to be the host, so it's going to be whatever the host is, and then the second one is going to be the IP of that host. So we'll be able to see the IP of the host if it's a host, or if it's some application, then we'll be able to see the application as well. So if it's an application, instead of a host is going to be a user agent or some app or something, and it's going to give us the name of that. So that's what this log is doing. And whenever we use this log, you're going to see how it looks in a minute. And then now we can put some of the logic in. So in order to make sure that my application doesn't crash every time there's an error, I'm going to put everything inside of the try catch block. So I'm going to put try and then opening curly braces, and then I'm going to have a catch block. So we're going to say catch, and then we're going to catch some error, which we don't know. So I'm going to put unknown for now for the type. And then we're going to have opening and closing curly braces. And then here we can return an error. But for now, we're going to work on whatever we're going to be doing in the try block. So here we need to get a connection. That's the first thing we need to do, because we need to execute a query on the database, get the patients, and then return the patient. So in here, I'm going to create a constant, and I'm going to call it pool, because that's the pool. And then I'm going to use the await keyword. So await, and then call the connection. So we're going to say connection. You can see that's coming from our configuration, semicolon. So we're going to see if we can get a connection from the pool by just calling in the pool. And in here, we're going to create another constant. I'm going to call it result. So that's going to be the result that I get from the database. And let's just give this of type of any for now. And then we're going to set this equal to another await, because this is another promise. And then we're going to call the pool and then query. Okay, so we're going to query the pool and then pass in the request and then any parameters that we need to pass in here. So to do this again, I'm going to call the query. So we're going to call our query, and then we need to call select patients. So here we're going to click select patients. So what this is going to do is going to go to the database, do whatever it needs to do, and then get all the patients and return them to us. So once we get the patient, then everything goes well, then we can return. So we're going to say return, oops. And here we need to return the response that status. So we're going to say status. And then here, of course, we're going to pass in our code that okay. And let's make sure we can import this. So go over here, quick fix, import. So we're going to pass it on okay. And then for the data, so that send, we're going to pass in a new HTTP response. So I'm going to put this on the new line this time so you guys can see it and tab it in a little. HTTP response, so HTTP response, that's our domain. And we're calling constructor, so we need to pass it in some message. So the first one is going to be code that okay, because everything went well. Then we need to give it a status. So we're going to say status that okay, because everything went well. And then we need to give it a message. You can see it up here. So the next thing in blue, in the little pop-up window, that's what we haven't put in yet. So here we're gonna say patients retrieved. Okay, so we retrieved the patients. Now we need to pass in the actual data. So we haven't used the data yet, but now we're gonna go ahead and use it. So you can see that it's optional. It can be undefined or it can be an object. And for this, I'm gonna pass in the result. So we're gonna say result and then get the first item. So if we get the first item, then it's gonna give us the list of all the patients that they found in a database after passing in the query here, which is the select patients. So I'm going to copy this again and then go down here, no line, paste, and then remove one line. Now, if we get an error, of course, we need to pass in some error message here. So we don't have any data if we get an error. So I'm going to remove the data part. Remember, it's optional, so it's not going to give us an error. And then in here, oops, I'm going to go ahead and select all this and do Control D. And I want to change this to internal server error. So I'm going to say internal server error. So every time there's an error, we're not going to tell the user exactly what happened. We're just going to send an error to the front end. So here, we're just going to change this message, say something like error occurred, okay? We just don't tell them exactly what happened. They just know that there's an error, they get a 500, and that's all they need to know. But for us, we can go ahead and log this as well. So we can log the error so that we can see what the error is. So we can come down here and do console log. Actually, we need to do console.error and then passing in the error message. So we're going to say error. Okay, so we as the developers will be able to see exactly what the error is, but whoever is sending the request to the application, they're just going to get a 500 and then they're going to get this message, an error occur. We don't have to give them any, explicit description of what the error is, because again, we don't want to expose our application internal workings. Now, one thing I do want to fix is this any here, because I don't like to use any. I would rather use unknown instead of any. So let's see what this returns. So you can see here, if I put my mouse on it, you can see that the return type is a number of things, right? So what we can do is we can copy all this and then create a type that's going to represent this type. So I'm going to go ahead here and just copy everything in here. I'm going to use my keyboard to Control C and then come up here. And then we can use the type now. So we can say type, so the TypeScript type, and we can give it a name. So I'm gonna call mine result set, and then set it equal to this type. I'm gonna paste this in. Okay, so put a semicolon in the end and make sure we import all those things. So let's come here, import. This is supposed to come from MySQL 2 because that's the version that we're using. And I think everything else is gonna come from there. So let's do quick fix, import everything. Okay, so everything should come from MySQL 2. So the field packet, OK packet, result set header, and a raw data packet. So all of these are possible return type that can happen with the query. So we create one result set and then we just give it a union type. So it's an array that can have a raw data packet array or just a raw data packet double array or whatever. And then an OK packet or an OK packet array can have some result set header or a field packet, which is an array. So we create one type that's gonna encompass all these types. So now we can just use this type here so that we don't have to use this any. Paste it in here. You can see we get no errors because it's a union type. So if it's not one, then it's the other. And this is going to be our first route that we're going to be using. Now we won't be able to test this yet because we don't have the database connection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put all the other functions that I need. So this is to get patients. So we need another one to get one patient and then create a patient, update a patient, and then delete a patient. So we're going to continue with those. And then once we're done, to be able to test everything, we're going to put our database configuration file. So the configuration we need to pass in so that we can pass these values in. So remember, we're passing in this DB host, user, password, etc. So we need to pass those in using the .env file, which is why we brought in this library in here. So we're going to be doing this and then we'll be able to test all these functions that we're going to have here. But I'm not going to do that yet. I want to be able to just finish everything inside of the controller. And then we're going to put the configuration so that the application can connect to MySQL. So let's go ahead and create our next function. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy that one. I can collapse it and then go over to the next line and then paste it. So this one is going to be to get one patient and everything else is going to be the same here, except now we have to change the query. So to get one patient, we're going to call the get patient query. And we also need to pass in the patient ID. And to do this, we put a comma and then we put an array and then we're passing in whatever we need to pass in here as an array. And to get the ID, we're just going to get it from the request. So request.params that let's call it patient ID. Okay, so that's going to be the ID that we're going to be looking for. So as a parameter in the request is going to come with the patient ID, and that's what we're going to get. We're going to give it to the query because the query is expecting the patient ID. So just to refresh your mind a little bit, so if we go back inside of this query, so the select patient, you can see that I have a question mark here for the ID. So we need to pass in this ID as an array. After we pass in the query here, we separate it by the comma, as you can see here. So separate the query by a comma and then pass in an array that's going to contain all of the parameters that we need to give to the query. In this case, we only need to give it one because we're just specifying the ID. So that's going to be our query. And then what I want to do is to check to see if I have something returned to me, because if I don't, then I want to send a different response. If I do get the patient, then I'm just going to send a 200 and then say we found the patient. But if I didn't, then I want to send something like, the patient was not found or something like that, and then send a not found HTTP status code. So let's go ahead and check the result and then see if we have anything in there. So to do this, I'm going to use an if statement. So we're going to say if, and then I'm going to look inside of the result. So we're going to say result and then access the first element. So bracket and then 0. And we need to get this as an array because we need to check the length of this, because whenever we send a query to select something, MySQL is going to return some kind of an array. And that's why we're trying to get the first element in the array. So we need to do as array, and then we'll give it a type of any, okay, because it can be anything, or we can give it a type of result set actually. So we can come in here and say result set, and then we need to check in the length to see if it's greater than 0. So I'm going to select everything and then put an opening parenthesis. So what this is going to do is it's going to put a closing one. You can see that everything is enclosed inside a parenthesis. And then now I can do that since it's an array, because I just turned it into an array. Now we can access the length, and then we're going to check to see if this is greater than 0. So greater than 0. So if this is the case, that's when we're going to return the OK response. So in here, I'm just going to move this over, cut it, and then just paste it here. Okay, so if this is the case, then we know we get the patient, then we send that one patient. You can see we're doing here, accessing the first parameter in the result. We know that we didn't get the patient, so I'm going to say else, then we can send the 404. So in here again, I'm going to paste this and then just change this to not found. So I'm going to come in here, select all of them, and then do not found. Okay, so we're going to change to a not found, and then change the message as well to patient not found. And of course we don't have any data, so I'm going to go ahead and remove this. And here we need to change this to singular, so let's go over here, and then we're just going to remove that S, so patient retrieve. So before we return anything to the user, we check to see if we get a response. If we do, then we go ahead and send the response. Otherwise, we're just going to say, hey, we didn't find this patient, because MySQL is not going to give us an error if we didn't find the patient. It's just going to return an empty set. So we're just doing this to enhance the user experience a little bit. And the error is going to be the same. So the error is going to be the same thing. We're not going to change the error, but you can do something else here if you want. So feel free to do that. But in my case, if there's an error, which can be anything here, we can have an error with this connection, we can have an error with this query, we can have some error in here. You never know what can happen. So whatever the error is, I'm just going to say, hey, some error occur, and then I log the error. And me as the developer, I can check that error later in the console and then debug the application further. But the, caller of the application or the user of the application, then they're not going to know exactly what happened. They will just say, hey, we got an internal server error. But again, feel free to change that if you want to be more specific with your errors. So let's go ahead and work on the next function, and I'm just gonna go ahead and copy this one again, and I'm gonna go ahead and collapse it. But before I do, I'm gonna change the return type. You can see now this is not returning an array, it's just returning one patient. So I'm gonna remove the bracket and collapse it, and then go on to the next line and then paste that. So this is gonna be the create patient function. So I'm gonna do create patient, and it's gonna return one patient. So I'm gonna delete this as well. And the first line here is gonna be the same. The try catch, we're gonna need that, so we're gonna keep that, but we don't need this if statement. So I'm going to copy everything in here and then remove the if statement. So all of this, and then go on a no line and then paste this. Well, I need to remove this as well. So let's remove this if statement. We don't need the if statement. But what I do want to do is whenever I execute this query, so we're going to change this as well to create patient. So we're going to send this query, and then we need to pass in the values that are coming with the request. Okay, so we know that the request body, which is going to contain the JSON information, is going to have everything that we need. So to do this, I'm going to remove this and call the object, so the JavaScript object, and then call the values. So when we pass in an object, or a JSON object in this case, to this, then it's going to return all the values and then put them in an array. Now we need to get all of this information coming from the request, and I'm gonna do this right above the try. So I'm gonna go up here and create a quick patient. So I'm gonna do let patient, and then we're gonna give it a type of patient because we created that interface. So we're gonna say patient, and we're gonna set this equal to an object, and then we're just gonna copy everything that we got from the request coming in. So we're gonna say request.body, okay, because we know that the body should contain all of the JSON information to create the new patient. And then now we can just go ahead in here and then pass in that patient. Remember, when we pass in an object, oops, not patient route, that's supposed to be patient. And then make sure this was not imported here and remove it. Okay, so again, let me scroll down. So whenever we call the object.values, it's going to remove all of the values inside of the object, put them in an array, which is why I removed the bracket, because this values is already going to return an array. You can see here it's returning an array of any type. That's what I'm doing here. So now after the request is successful, so the patient is created, I want to send that patient back, like the new patient. I want to be able to send this patient back to the user so that they can see the new patient that is created. So to do this again, I'm going to do patient and then set it equal to a new object. So here I'm going to say equal, opening and close again. And what I need to do is to set the ID, because now the patient is going to have an ID. And to get the ID, I'm going to say result, because it's going to come from the result. And we want to access the first element. And this is going to be a result set header, because whenever you create something, then they send you a result set header in this case, and that's going to contain the insert ID. And that's what we need. So to do this, I'm going to say as result set header. Okay, so again, to access the ID, I'm gonna select everything and then put an opening parenthesis, and it's gonna put the closing for me. Now if I do dot, then you can see I have access to everything inside of the result set header, because I just cast this object as that. So now I can access the insert ID, and then I can copy everything else that came in with the request, because the information is going to be the same. So request body, and then in here I can just return that patient as the data. So I'm going to say patient, and then pass it in here just like that. So another thing that I did in a course before that course, another course that's very similar to this course, but instead of using TypeScript, I was just using regular JavaScript. What I did is I didn't like that I had to do this on the fly as I'm doing here. So I created a store procedure, and then I called the store procedure instead, and the store procedure would create the patient and then select that patient and return it to me. But in this case, I'm not doing it. So if you're interested, check my other course about Node.js. You will see how I created a store procedure like a MySQL or SQL store procedure. And then instead of returning this fake patient here, I guess, I actually returned the patient that got created in the database with the created date and everything. You can see here with this patient, we're not going to have the created at, because this is going to be stamped at the database level. So we're not going to have the date that the patient was created, which was really annoying to me because I didn't like that. So I created a store procedure and then fixed the problem. I'm not doing this in the course, but feel free to check out my other course. It's a free course, and you'll see how I created a store procedure. And all you have to do is just change that one line. Just change this query and then pass in the result like this, and then grab the first element. It will give you the patient from the database, because the store procedure will return the actual patient. So you can create the store procedure in the query. You can just check it out in the course and you'll see how I did it. And all you have to do, the only change you have to do inside of this class, like this very class, is to just change this query here. And of course, get rid of this and then access the result, and then access the first element, then it will give you the patient. And then we also have to change these messages. So I'm gonna select all of them with Control D, and then we need to pass in the created. So I'm gonna say created, because that's a 201. We just created something on the server, and then change the message as well as patient created. Oops, created. Okay, so pretty easy, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and work on the update patient now. So I'm going to collapse this one and copy this one above it, because the select one is going to be very similar to that one. So I'm going to go ahead and copy it and collapse it again and go down and then paste this. So this is going to be the update patient. So I'm going to change this to update. So of course, first two lines are going to be the same. We're going to try to get the patient to see if the patient exists in the database. And then if that's not the case, we're going to again send a not found that we didn't find the patient. So we're not going to try to update the patient unless we check the database and we see that the patient is actually inside of the database. So what I'm going to do is expand that and copy this line right here and collapse it again and then paste this in here. So I'm going to come here, paste it, put this on a new line. So we're going to create a patient with the patient information coming in the request body, and then get the connection, see if we can find that patient. So again, we're going to send the select patients and then pass in the patient ID that they pass in inside of the query as a parameter in the request. And then we're going to check to see if the patient is there. So if we got something in the result, and if that's the case, then we're going to do something else. So I'm going to copy this query again. So we're going to check to see if there is a patient. If there is one, which means the length of this is bigger than 0, then in here we're going to send another request. So now I'm going to put this over here and we're going to call the update patient. So I'm going to change this to update patient, and to update the patient we need to pass in all the information that we get from the request body. So the request body, we're copying everything inside of this variable here. So I'm going to copy this variable and I'm going to change this to object.values, and then passing in this object. So I'm going to pass in this object. Remember, we're already inside of an array here. So I'm going to copy everything instead of creating a new array by using the 3 dots. So that's the spread operator again in action. Now, because I do this, I can pass in the next parameter. So I'm going to copy this again and then pass it in as the ID. So I'm going to put a comma, space, and then paste this in. So if we go inside of the query, you can see that for the update, we're going to need to pass in the first name, the last name, email, address, diagnosis, font status, image URL, and then lastly, we need to pass in the ID. And that's what I'm doing here. So when we call the values on the object and then we give it this guy right here, so it's going to remove everything, put them inside of an array, and we only want one array, which is why we copy everything that's going to come inside of this array. We put them in here. So that's going to be just one array instead of two arrays. And then we pass in the last parameter, which is the ID. And those are all the parameters that we need to pass into this update query. So let's move over here. So after we run the second query, then we can just send the OK, and then we can say patient updated, and we can pass in the patient as well. So another thing we can do here, create this object on the fly. So in here, what I can do is dot patient. So we're going to copy everything that we already have in the patient, and then we can pass in the ID. So we can say ID, and then we get it from the request that params that patient ID. All right, let me scroll over so you guys can see everything. So we're just returning this new object, which is going to be the actual patient that just got updated. So really, we're not doing anything with this result, but feel free to check it out and see what's inside of it, and then see if you can use some of the information. But I'm just creating this patient on the fly because I know that the same information that they're passing in here in the request body, that information is going to be the same. We're just going to return the same thing to them. And I'm going to scroll over, and the error again always going to be the same. So we're not going to touch the error. The error is going to be the same. So now we just need to work on the delete. So copy this again one last time, and then collapse it, and go down, paste it, and change the name of the function. So this is the delete patient. So we're going to say delete. So the delete patient is going to be very similar to the update patient. The only thing is we don't need this. So we're going to delete this, and we're going to call the select patient, pass in the patient ID because we're going to check to see if the patient is there. We have our if statement. So if the patient exists, then that's when we're going to update the patient or delete the patient in this case. So we're going to say delete patient, and we're passing in the patient ID. Well, actually, I'm going to undo this and leave it there. So if the patient is present, then we're going to delete. So we have to do it inside of the if statement. So here we're going to say delete patient and pass in this instead. So we just need to pass in the ID to this guy right here. So go in here, scroll over, select everything, and then paste. Okay, so if the patient exists, which we're doing on the lines above, then we're gonna delete the patient. Otherwise, we're gonna say the patient was not found, and then here we can change the message to patient deleted. So patient deleted, and we can get rid of this because we're not sending them any data. We're just telling them that the operation was successful. So remove this object. All right. And the status is okay, and otherwise, which means we didn't find that patient, then we're gonna send another not found, and then we say patient was not found. And we're gonna test all those functionalities as well, just to make sure everything is working as expected. So that's all we have to do for this controller, and let me expand everything so you guys can see. Scroll down, scroll back up. So we have the get patients to get all the patients, and then we have the get patient to get one patient. And then we have the create patient so that we can create a patient on the server. And then we have update patient so that we can update a patient. And then lastly, we have the delete patient so that we can delete one patient. So we have all of our CRUD operations. Now we just need to go ahead and test all this code that we just put in there. So I'm going to close everything, and we're going to go inside of the routes. So let's go down here, close the query. So we need to go inside of the routes. Remember, we don't have anything in here. So now we have to call those functions and then pass them to the proper routes. And this is going to be really easy. So let's collapse this. So what we need to do is to say, we're going to call the patient route. So we're going to say patient route, and then we're going to say route because we're trying to route something. And then we're going to go to /. So /, and for the /, we're going to say, hey, if it's a get request, it's going to go there. So for the get request, we're going to call get patient. Okay, so the get patient. All right, so the get request on the / is also going to go for get patients. And it can also go to a post request. So if they send a post request to just /, which is really / patients, because we're prefixing it with patients and the app class. So here we're going to say that can also go to the create patient. So we're going to say create patient if it's a post request. Let me go back here so you guys can understand what's going on here. So if I go to the app, right, I prefix everything with /patients, which means this / is really just /patients. So if they go to /patients, it can go to a get request, which is going to go to get patient, and this is supposed to be patients. So get patients, go ahead and import that. So you can go to get patients. If they just go to /patients, it's going to give them all the patients. If it's a get request, if it's a post request, then it's going to go to create patients. And then we need another one. So I'm going to go down. Well, I have to finish this with a semicolon, and then I'm going to go down and then say patient routes again. And now when I'm route again, and what I want to do is to access the ID. So I'm going to say another route, but but this time we're gonna expect a parameter, and that's called the patient ID. Remember, that's the same patient ID that we're referencing inside of the controller, so make sure you have the same name. And then in here we can also accept a get request. So if it's a get request, then we know that they're trying to get one patient, so we're gonna call get patient. Remember, get patient is expecting the patient ID, and it's gonna return one patient. And you can also go to put for the update patient, and if that's the case, then we're gonna send them to update patient because that's a put request. And then lastly, we're gonna pass in the delete. So we're gonna see if it's a delete request, then send this to the delete patient. So we're gonna call the delete patient, and then I'm gonna put a semicolon here. So now all of our routes is set up. And remember, the same name that you put in here as the parameter that you're expecting, it's the same name you need to have in the controller. So if we go inside of the controller real quick, let's go to get patient. So this, or the update patient, you can see that we're passing in this patient ID here. Okay, so make sure these names are the same, or the whatever, the string is the same. So again, if they go to /patients, and why this is /patients, because we're prefixing it inside of the app right here as patient. So whenever we say slash, we're really saying /patients. So if it goes to /patient and it's a get request, then they're really calling get patients. If it's a post request, then they're trying to create a patient. If they go to /patient and then / some ID, then they're calling get patient. If it's a get request. If it's a pull request, then it's the update. If it's a delete, then it's the delete patient. So that's all the routes that we need to set up for the application. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to provide the environment variables so that we can load this configuration file and then connect to the database. And that's what we're going to be doing. What we need to do now is to create a .env file that's going to contain those database configuration variables so that .env can find the file and then load it up and then make sure these variables are available whenever the application is needing them. So I'm going to go over here and collapse everything, and we need to go inside of the root of the application. So I'm going to click on any of those files here and then create a new file. So here I'm going to call it .env. Okay, so .env, that's going to be the configuration file, and I'm going to close everything else. Okay, so this file is where we're going to put all of the configuration, or the values for the configuration for the database. So let's see if we can leverage some of this stuff here. So I'm going to copy everything here and close this and then paste everything in here. So we're going to pass in this DB host. So delete and delete all this. All right, so we're going to pass in values for all of these, and .env is going to load this file and make sure that these values are available. Well, not here. Whenever the configuration needs them. You can see here we're passing in those values for these variables. So in here, the DB host, that's my local host for now. So we're gonna say localhost. The user is gonna be root, and this is just for testing on my local. Whenever we're gonna deploy the application using Docker, then we're gonna be using an actual user and not the root user, because it's a very bad idea to use the root user. My password is let me in. The database is gonna be the patients DB, and the port is 3306. Connection limit, I'm gonna pass 10 again, and we can pass in the server port because that's also something that's gonna be on the process. So we're gonna say server underscore port, and we can set this equal to some number like 5000. So this is the database configuration values that we're putting in here, and these are going to be loaded because we have that env here, and they're going to be available in the process, as you can see here. So that's what we're doing here. We're just passing in actual values for this because we don't want to put them here. And the reason we put them inside of the .env file is because we want to be able to test locally. So when we deploy the application using Docker, then this can be set as environment variable because we're accessing them on the process. So we make this very flexible instead of hard coding values inside of this configuration itself. So that's why we do it that way. We could have just passed in the values directly in here, but we pass them on the process because we want this to be very flexible, because you might want to, pass in different database configuration to the application depending on different environments and things like that. So that's always a very good way to do this. So at this point, we should be able to test the application, and the only thing that we have to do is, if you look inside of our queries, so if I extend the query, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating the patients DB database, and then create the patients table, and then define the table with these values like this, because whenever we're going to execute these queries, it's going to actually look in the MySQL database server. So we need to make sure that these tables and things exist. So let's go ahead and do that. So one thing I didn't mention when we were going over the requirements that you need to have in terms of software is that you have to have MySQL running on your computer. Now, if you have an instance of it running on some other computer in your house or somewhere else, then feel free to use it. But you need to have MySQL server installed on your computer or installed somewhere where you can access it so that we can go ahead and connect to it. In my case, I have it installed on my Windows computer that I'm using here, which is why I pass in localhost as my host for the MySQL server. And right now I'm using MySQL Workbench. It's a very fully loaded application that you can use to work with MySQL, but you can use any other client that you want, because right now I'm just going to be writing raw SQL. I'm not actually going to be using the Workbench features to create the database and create the tables and all that. But you can go ahead and do that if you prefer, but I'm going to show you how we can write all the queries so that we can create the database, create the tables. So we need to create the database. So I'm going to say create. I'm going to see if I can zoom in a little bit so you guys can see better. So we want to say create database, and we're gonna say if not exist. So if it doesn't exist, then go ahead and create it, and we're gonna call it patients DB. Remember, that's what we call it. And then we want to say use this database. So we're gonna say use patients DB because we want to use that database for the next queries that we're gonna execute. And then we're gonna say let's do drop table if exist again. So if the table exists, go ahead and drop it, and that table is going to be the patients table. So the patients table, if it exists, just drop it because we're going to recreate it. And maybe I'm not going to put the space in between because I'm going to scroll down a little. So the first thing I want to do is create table. So create table, and we're going to call it patients. So we're going to drop it if it already exists, and then we're going to create it again, and then we're going to pass in all the values here. So in there, let's go up on the line and let's move over. So we can pass in the ID, and we know that's going to be a big integer. So we're going to say big int, and it's going to be a positive. So unsigned. And it cannot be null because it's the primary key. So not null, and it should be auto increment so that we don't have to worry about it. So auto increment. Okay, so that's for the ID. Then we need the first name. So we're gonna say first underscore name, and this is gonna be a varchar. I'm just gonna put all of the SQL queries in uppercase and everything else in lowercase. So that's a varchar max 255, and this can be null. So we're gonna say default and then null. So if they don't pass anything, the default is gonna be null. And I'm gonna go ahead and just copy all this because most of these values are strings, and then I'm gonna paste it down a few times. So first one is the name, the second one is the last name. So let's go ahead and change this to last name. We need the email, so this is gonna be the email. And then we need the address, so this is gonna be the address. And we need the diagnosis, and we need the phone. And I'm gonna go ahead and paste this a few more times. Paste, paste, paste. And after the phone, we need the created at. So actually we need to pass in the status. So status, and let's change the status to something like 30 because it's gonna be like, you know, hospitalized, active or inactive or something like that. And the phone also to 30 because most phone numbers are like 10 digits, but we're just gonna give him 30. And then we can pass in the created at. So created underscore at, and this is gonna be a timestamp. So we're gonna change it to timestamp. Okay, so that's the type, which is a timestamp, and the default is going to be the current timestamp so that we don't have to pass this in at all. So current timestamp. So whatever the timestamp is on the server, on the MySQL server, just use that as the default if they don't pass anything, which we're never gonna do because we want MySQL to just put in the timestamp for us. And then for the last one, that's gonna be the image URL. So let's go ahead and change this. We're gonna say image underscore URL. And let's see if we can format this a little. So I'm gonna put everything to the same level as the first name because it's the longest string here. So the first name. So we have first name, ID, first name, last name, email, address, diagnosis, phone, status, created at, and then the image URL. Now we have to say the primary key. So primary key is the ID. I can put a space here just for clarity. So ID is the primary key, and then we need to put a constraint on the email because we want all the email to be unique. So we're gonna say constraint, and there's a naming convention for this. So unique for UQ underscore the table name, so patients. And then we want this to be unique. And then we want to specify the actual column, which is the email column. All right, and that's what we have to do. And then we can set the auto increment again to 1 so that we can start at 1. But I think that's the default behavior, but it's not gonna hurt to specify it here again. So equal 1. Okay, so it's gonna start by auto incrementing by using 1. So it's gonna put the first one as 1, and then it's gonna go from there, and then adding 1 1 1. So that's everything we have to do to create everything. And let's just highlight this because I have some more queries on top and I don't want to execute them. So it's gonna execute whatever is highlighted, and let's go ahead and run this. And you can see down there, everything was successful. We got a warning because the table didn't exist, but that doesn't do anything. So if we refresh this now, you can see we have this patients DB database. And if I expand this tables, you can see we have the patient, and I can select everything. You can see we have everything here. And I can also go here and click on this little gear, and it's going to give us a description. So ID, first name, primary key, everything. So you can check this out to make sure that everything that you entered was actually put in correctly. And you can see the timestamp, the current timestamp as the default, and everything else that we specified. So I'm going to close this and go back here. And all right, so everything is good. And we can also put this in the application as well. So I'm going to copy all this and then go back to the application, and we're going to create another folder here just so you guys can have it. So let's go here and click on the new folder. I usually call it db init. And then inside of here, I'm going to create a new file, and that's going to be init.sql, like an initial file, and I'm just gonna paste everything in here. So that's everything we just put in the database, and then we just put them in here just for your reference. And also what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna link to this file whenever I'm gonna Dockerize the application, because I want the database to be created automatically whenever I run the container. So we're also gonna be using this file in the application as well whenever we're gonna Dockerize the application. So now if everything goes well, we should be ready to test the application. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm gonna go ahead and open my terminal and clear the screen and up arrow key. So we're gonna run the dev server again. So let's press enter on that. All right, everything looks good. We didn't get any errors, and our application is running now on 5000 because we passed in the port in the .env file. So we know that this file was loaded and the application was able to read it. So I'm going to be using Postman. So hopefully you guys are familiar with this application. So make sure you have your Postman open. So that's what I'm going to be using. So I'm going to open Postman, and I don't have any requests yet. So I'm going to close this panel and then open a new tab. And here I want to go to http:// and we want to go to localhost, or we can just go to the IP address. So let me minimize this a little and get this IP address here. I'm gonna click on copy, bring this back up, expand it, and paste it in here. So we want to go to this IP address, which is my local computer, and let's just send a GET request. So if we send this GET request, we should get the message that says welcome to the API. So send this request, and you can see we get the response. So I'm gonna scroll up a little. You can see the 200 OK. We have it here as well, and then we have the welcome to the patient's API, and then we have the timestamp. So if we go now to / some random path that doesn't exist, which we already tested, but we're just testing everything again, and then send the request. Then we have a 404 not found. Route does not exist on the server because we just went to some route that doesn't exist. So now if we go back to / patients, which is going to fetch all the patients in the database. So if we send this, we should have an empty data. So let's go ahead and send that. And you can see we had a 200 OK, and for our data, we didn't get any patients. So it's an empty array. So this is working. So I'm going to duplicate this. So duplicate. And we're gonna send a post request this time. Now we need to pass in the request body. So we're gonna go here, go to raw, and then select the JSON, and we're gonna pass in our JSON values in here. So remember, we need to pass in the first name, last name, email, address, diagnosis, phone, status, and then the image URL. So we're gonna say first name. So now if we send this post request with this information, we should be able to create the patient. So let's go ahead and click send. And you can see we get a 201 created. And if you scroll down, you can see we get all the information coming back to us with all the HTTP status and everything. So now if we go back to the previous tab and we send the GET request to get all the patients again, now you can see in our data, we get one patient, which is the patient that we just entered. And we know that this is coming from the database because we have decreated that, and we get the timestamp on the MySQL server. So let's go ahead and do another one. So here I'm going to scroll down and then change this to John, and change this to Doe, and change this to John. Address is the same, everything else can be the same, so just the name so that we can see something else. And then I'm going to send this again. All right, so you can see again it was created. Go back here, send the request again. now we have 2 patients. So you can see the patient with ID 2 is on top because we sort everything by the created date descending, and then we can see the 2 patients right here. So everything seems to be working. So let's go ahead and test the get 1 patient. So here I'm gonna go do / pass in 2. So that should give me the patient with ID 2. So let's press enter. And you can see patient retrieve, and we get that 1 patient by ID 2. And if I change this to 1, then we should get me. So send, you see that I get return. So let's see if we can update a patient. So go back here, duplicate this tab. I'm going to change this to a put request and then pass in the ID. So I'm going to pass in myself. So ID 1, and we need to pass in the body as well. So the body is going to be the same, but now we can change information if you want. So let's say now instead of, let's say my name is still going to be Junior, but my last name is going to be Smith, and my email is going to be Smith, let's say Smith J. We should see now my last name is Smith, and then my email is Smith J, and then everything else is the same for both of them, so we're not going to change anything. So if I send this put request, you can see I get 200, and now if I scroll up a little, you see that my name is now Junior Smith and my email is Smith. And if I go back to the first tab and send this request again, you can see the new information for patient with ID 1, and you can see the information is different. We have to test the delayed patient. So let's duplicate this tab again, and we're going to send this request to patient 1, and then we're going to get the delete. So we don't need to send anything. We don't need to send any body or anything. We can get rid of this, but we just need to send this ID. So I'm going to send this delete to the patients and then pass in the ID. So I should be deleted. So send this request, and you see patients deleted, and then we get the 200. So now if we go back to the first tab and then send this request, it's going to give us patient not found because the patient was deleted. So if I remove the 1 and then send this to patients, and we have only 1 patient here. So everything is working as expected. We have tested all the functionalities. So now let's go back to the database and see if we can find this patient. So I'm going to open MySQL Workbench again, and now I'm going to refresh this and select everything. So select everything here, and you can see we have that 1 patient in here. Let's go ahead and add another patient just so that we can see something else in here. Let's go back to Postman, and let's go to the second tab, and I think I can do Control Z here and then send me again. So we're going to send this patient again. So I'm going to click send. So the patient was created. And while we're here, let's also test this constraint that we have on the email, so that if we send the same email twice, then it should get rejected. So if I send this, we should get an error. So send this. You can see we get an internal server error. And if we look in the console, you can see that we have duplicate entry for this email for key patient, which is supposed to be unique, which is the email, as you can see here. So we know that this constraint is working as far as the database is concerned. And this is just to avoid having 2 patients with the same email. So that's just an example that I'm showing you with this, because I work on another project where I make sure that every user has a unique email. And I just wanted to show you this, which is a pretty simple solution, but you can use this in any other applications. So let's go back to the workbench and request this again. You can see now we have 2 patients, which is John Doe and myself. So everything seems to be working. And of course, make sure you can play around with this some more. You can test it some more if you want and change things here and there. Everything should be working as expected. So we've really covered a lot from, learning TypeScript as a beginner, and then building an entire application using TypeScript, and, create an entire backend application and set things up. So you should really congratulate yourself because you make it so far in the course, and hopefully you understand everything. And of course, if you don't, then you can take the source code and then see things for yourself, and send me an email if you need to. If you have questions, just let me know, then I should be able to help you. But at this point, you have built an entire application, which is a backend API that is connected to a MySQL database, and data is being persisted and everything is working. Exceptions are being handled. As you can see here, we're handling errors and everything. And really, this is just an example. You can see how you can change things here depending on what application you're building. But at least this is a good, solid building block for whatever else you have planned in the future that you want to work on, either project or jobs or whatever the case might be. Then you should have a pretty good understanding of how to build an application and then have it working in the way that you want. So the next thing that we're going to be doing is just some tuning in the application, and then we're going to go ahead and then use Docker to deploy the application. There's a couple of things that I want to point out in this application. So if we go inside of the controller, so let's expand this and then expand the controller, and I'm going to close this panel. You can see that we're using the console log to log information on the console, or just to log information in general in the application. So I wouldn't recommend to use the console log because there are other libraries out there that you can use with Node.js that would give you a lot more than just using the console log. Now there's nothing wrong as far as I know using the console log, but I would much rather use an actual library that is dedicated to just logging information, and that way we can have better and nicer looking logging. So that is one thing that I wanted to point out, because you can see here I'm just using the console log and all the different functions, and if this was gonna go to production, then I would probably do some research and then see if I can find some very good logging library for Node.js, and then I would use that instead of using just the console log here that comes standard with Node.js. And then another thing I want to point out is the return type. So if you take a look at this return type, for example, so you can see here what we're returning is just a response, and then we're passing in some information. So if you look, for example, at this response, right? So if we go in there, and to do this on Windows, I'm gonna press Control and then just click it. Well, I don't want to go inside of patient, but I want to go inside of the response, which is coming from Express. So if I click in there, you can see that it's expecting a type, which is a response body, and by default they set it to any. Now if I double click on this just to highlight it and then scroll up a little bit to see where this is defined, you can see that there's nothing up there, right? And it's defined down there. If I scroll down, you can see it's defined here, and it's really just any. And this is a definition file, so it's a type definition file. You can see the .d here, but really this is just set to any. So there's not really a lot of reinforcement in terms of like typing this. So that's one thing. And the second thing is we're returning an HTTP response here. So it would make more sense to return an HTTP response instead of patient, because the patient is part of the response. If I scroll over a little, you'll see that we're returning this result here and then grabbing the first element because it's an array, and this is gonna give us a result set, which is going to be like an array of patients. But that's also part of the entire HTTP response object. So it makes sense to change this to HTTP response. So I'm just gonna see if I can highlight all of this and then press Ctrl D to select all of them. So I have all of them selected, and then I'm gonna do space and then go in here and then just change that one. So if I scroll up, everything else should be changed. You can see here this is changed. Now, another thing is there's no way that we're returning an array of HTTP response because we're just returning one response. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the brackets. And let me just make sure everything is all right. So the promise of response of HTTP response, and I get it for everything. Okay, but really this can be anything because this is not being reinforced. Technically, this is really any. We just look at this, if you remember. So this is really any, so it doesn't really do anything. And if we want, we can force type this, but we really don't have to do this at this point because we know that whatever I pass here, it will still work because it's on any type really that's under the hood. But at least for clarity, just so that we can see it, then I'm passing in the right tab here, which is the HTTP response, which you can see that we're sending as a response here to the user. But really, that's any type. But just wanted to make that correction. Instead of patient, we're really returning HTTP responses. And those are just some of the things that jumped out of me when I was looking at this again and editing some of the videos, and I wanted to show you guys that we should probably fix those things. But again, I'm sure there's more tuning that you can actually do to this application, so feel free to do that. And if you want, you can also share some of those changes with me. That would just be fine. Really, the sky's the limit as to what can be changed in this application, and I'm sure you guys are going to find plenty of things that you can change. And I think that's all the tuning that I wanted to do for this application, at least for now. And what I want to work on next is the deploying of the application. So what we're going to be doing is, like I mentioned before, we're going to be using Docker, which is going to make everything a lot easier in terms of deployment. And if you really don't know anything about Docker, like you've heard of it or you haven't, and you really don't have any idea about Docker at all, then I would highly encourage you to like take some tutorial and then come back to continue the course, because this is not going to be an introduction to Docker. And also Docker is very, very popular and it's a revolutionary idea. But if you're a developer, I would highly encourage you to, look into Docker and see if you can understand it and play with it, even if you're not doing any DevOps or anything like that, because it helps a lot to understand how Docker works, because it's being used a lot in, at least in deploying things and testing things and many other different areas in the software development process. So Docker is really, really a game changer in the industry. At least that's my opinion. So if you don't know anything about Docker, watch some tutorials on Docker and then come back to continue the course, because we're going to be using Docker to Dockerize the application and then deploy it on AWS. So hopefully by now you guys know what Docker is and you understand the concepts of containers and images and things like that. But just to give you a very brief introduction to Docker, like really short summary, Docker allows you to take one process and then have it run in an isolated environment on your computer. And they call those containers or running containers. And containers are created from images. You can think of the image as just a bundle application package. And by this, I mean, if you have the image, that means you can just run a container off of that image. And the first thing we're going to need to do is to create an image for our application. So we're going to have an image for the MySQL database that we're using, and we're going to have another image for the Node application itself so that we can run two containers, which means two isolated processes. In this case, that would be our two applications. Well, we have one application, but we also need one for MySQL because MySQL is also going to be running on the container, and we're just going to connect the two together. So Docker really is, it's not a new concept. It's been around for a while now, but it's something that's been revolutionary in the software industry. So you guys really should take the time and then, take some tutorials on Docker. So you should know at least the basics of Docker, like things like containers, images, mapping port from the container to the computer or to the host computer. So little things like this, because we're not going to be doing anything crazy. And this is the Docker website. So you can see they're very nice and polished website that they have. And they're extremely popular. You can see that by these numbers that they're showing here. And they're used by really big companies, like really big companies. And I'm talking about like things like Microsoft and Amazon and Netflix. As you can see, they put some of them on here, but they're being used in almost every company that, at least from what I know, from what I heard, they're being used very widely right now in the world. So this is a very good concept or a very good tool to have under your belt as a developer because it's extremely popular. And the way that I see it, this is not gonna go away like anytime soon. Like it's not one of those things that that is gonna die, but you never know. Someone might come up with something better. But for now, this is like a de facto technology in the software industry right now, which is Docker, that allows you to run processes. And I don't say run application because you can run anything. For example, we're gonna be running a MySQL database server. Now, this is a process, right? Those are considered process from an operating system point of view. So that's why I don't want to just narrow it down to just applications, but you can call them applications as well, because MySQL database server is an application that is running, but I think calling them processes is a better name. So Docker allows you to take the same computer and then run many different applications on that same computer without having to use a different operating system. So on the same system, you can run many different containers or many different isolated processes. In our case, we're going to run a MySQL database server, and then we're going to be running the Node application inside of a container. So like I said, hopefully you guys understand some of the basic concepts. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating an image for the Node application, and then we're going to take that image, we're going to put it in a Docker Compose file. And that's also another thing that you have to understand with Docker is the Docker Compose file. The Docker Compose file is like a convenience kind of thing. Like it allows you to run many different containers in one file instead of having to run every single image one by one. So you can run many different containers and having all the configuration in just one file. So that's what we're going to be doing. So let's go ahead and get started. So like I mentioned before, we need to run a container out of this application. So we need to find a way to take this application, turn it into something that we can run as a container on a computer or on a host computer. And one way we can do this in Docker world is to create a Docker file. And that's what we're going to be doing. So in the Docker file, we're going to put all the instructions so that we can create the container and then run the container. So I'm going to go over here and create a new file. I'm going to call it Docker file. Okay, no extension, just Docker file with a capital D. And I'm going to press enter. So this file is usually like just a few lines, but it's very powerful because it's going to allow us to put in all the instructions that we need to put in so that we can create the image. And then from there, we can run a container using the image. So I'm going to do Control B so that I can close the panel. And then I'm going to do from and then node, a colon, and then 17.2.0. So what we're saying here is that we're going to build an image, but we're not going to build it from scratch. We're going to use Node as our base image and then go from there. And then the colon is to specify the version. And in Docker world, those are called tags. So we're tagging this, aka giving this a version, which is 17.2.0. And why am I using this version in particular? Well, there's nothing special about this specific version. It's just that when I was building the application and when I ran the application and I know that the application was running on my local computer, it was running perfectly. This is the version of Node that I have installed on my computer, if I remember correctly. So in order to make sure that the application always runs no matter where it is, we have to specify the version that we use, or the version that we know will work with the application. And that's why I'm specifying 17.2 here, because I know on my local, when I tested the application, I had Node 17.2. So that's another thing to keep in mind. You don't want to put latest here, which is going to grab the latest version of Node, because this is not the version that you have when you were building the application and everything was working. And if you put latest here instead of a specific version, like you would do something like this, then every time someone will try to run a container out of this image, then it's gonna go and grab the latest version of Node, and that can break things in your application, because whenever you were building your application, you didn't use the latest version of Node. So we have to stick with the version that we know will work. In my case, the same version that I used when I was building the application, so 17.2. And then I want to define a working directory, and to do this, you do work dir, and I'm just gonna specify usr/code. So a lot of these base images, they use the Linux file system. So that's why we can specify the USR here. And even if we didn't use USR, like we use something completely different, like something that we made up, then it would just go ahead and create it for us. And then after that, I'm going to say copy. And then I want to copy the package.json file. So I'm going to say package.json. I just wanted to copy it over to code, because now code is our working directory. So everything that we copy is going to go inside of the usr/code. So after I copy this file, I want to do run npm install, or run npm I. I'm gonna type it out, just install. So after we copy the JSON file, we're gonna run npm install so that we can install all the dependencies and then create our node modules folder. And then after that, I want to copy the rest of everything. So I'm gonna say copy, and then I'm going to put a dot, a space, and a dot, which means copy everything from the current working directory. So that means that it's going to copy everything from here and then put it inside of USR code, because this is our context now. So whatever we do copy over, it's going to go inside of this folder. So let me go ahead and close the panel. And then after that, what I want to do is to expose the port. So I'm going to say expose 3000. What this is doing is it's exposing this port from inside of the container, which means whenever the container is running, this port is going to be open, and we know that this port is the port of our application. And we can pass this in as an environment variable as well, like we defined here. So if I go here and go to the application, so expand this, go to the app folder, you can see that I'm specifying here it can be from the process. And then after that, I'm going to specify the command to run whenever we're going to start the container. So to do this, I'm going to put an array, and then I'm going to do npm, and we're going to put run. So that's the second part of the command. And then the third part is the script that we specify, and this was start prod. Okay, so because we're running the prod environment right now. So the Docker file, like I said, is a very simple file, usually just gonna contain just a few lines, maybe 10 or 20 or 25 lines or something like that. And it's gonna be like very, very powerful, because with just a few lines, you can do a lot of things. And that's what we're doing here. So just to recap, we say, hey, our image is gonna be based off of the node image. So go ahead and get a node image as our base image, create this directory so that we can work in this directory, but we didn't have to do this. This is optional. It just helps organize things in case you have to do many different things. And then we copy the JSON file. Now here, sometimes people would copy the lag file, so they would also copy this file here, like the package-lag.json. I don't like to copy it. I just let it be recreated for me, because whenever we run npm install, then it's gonna recreate the package-lag.json. And then we copy everything else. We expose this port from inside the container, and then this is the command to run whenever someone is gonna run the image. Behind the scene, it's gonna run this command right here. And we know that this is a command to actually run the application. So we know we're going to have our dependencies install. Our port is going to be exposed as well. So 3000 is going to be exposed. Just these 7 lines, we'll be able to create an image off of this application, and then we can run that image as a container. Something else I do want to mention with the port that we're exposing here is that we can set it as an environment variable. Now, if you guys remember, if we go into the main application and the constructor, we collapse this, you can see that we have this server port here, which is an environment variable. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this so that I can show you this example. So another thing we can do with the port, we can make it dynamic even inside of the Docker file. So we can come here and then define an environment. So we're going to say env. This means we're defining an environment variable, and then the name is going to be server port. And then now we can give it the default value of 3000. So I can come here and say the default value is going to be 3000. Now in expose, instead of passing in the hard-coded 3000, we can do a $, and then we can refer to the server port. So that way, even inside of the Docker file, whenever we're gonna run it, and you're gonna see that a little bit later, meaning whenever we're gonna create an image out of this Docker file and then run that file, which is gonna be the running container, we'll be able to pass this as an environment variable whenever we're gonna start the container. So we can build an image and then run multiple different containers, and then we can map them to a different port. But you probably won't have to do that because you can have the same container and then you map it from different ports from the host. But this is important to know. So if you don't pass anything, it's also gonna use the 3000 as the default. Whenever we're gonna run this image, we're gonna run a container out of this image, or we can set the variable as an environment variable and it's gonna pick it up. And I'm gonna show you this in action in a second. So another important file that we need to put in here is the Docker ignore file. Now you can see on line 5 here, I'm copying everything over whenever I'm gonna create this image. Now the image doesn't need a lot of files here. You can see that we have configuration files, we have a bunch of other files here, and we don't need all these files whenever we're gonna start the container. So what we can do is we can create a Docker ignore file. So here I'm gonna say .docker ignore. So that's a Docker ignore file, and then we can put everything that we want to ignore, or we want Docker to ignore whenever it's copying file that we can see when we're doing here, and it's going to ignore everything that we put inside of here. So this is similar to a git ignore file. So in here we can put something like nodes module. So node modules, we don't want to copy these because you remember we're gonna again run npm install, so we don't need to copy this file here if it's here. We're just gonna run npm install, and that's gonna install it again and recreate this folder. So we can exclude this folder, and then we can exclude that git ignore. We can also exclude any like readme file, so readme.md, and we can exclude any like VS code configuration file because we don't need to copy those files inside of the image, and also any license file. So we can say license. So if we do have a license file, then it's not gonna go in. So whenever we build an image out of this Docker file, then all these files that we mentioned here, they will be ignored whenever we're copying things over. As you can see, we're doing on line 5 here. And this can improve the performance of your build a lot. And it's also very clean because you're not copying things that are not necessary inside of your image, and also reducing the size as well. So you usually do want to have a Docker ignore file because in most cases, you're not gonna be copying everything over whenever you want to copy application files inside of the image. So that's all we have to do for now for the Docker file. Now what I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna go ahead and build an image out of this Docker file, and then we're gonna run the application just to make sure that this Docker file is correct and we can run it and then run the application. So let's go ahead and do that. So I don't know if you guys can notice, but right now I'm on my Linux computer, and you can tell by looking at this menu at the top right corner here, you can see that it looks a little different. That's because I'm on my Linux computer, because that's the computer where I have Docker installed so that we can run those Docker commands. So this is our Docker file. I haven't changed anything in it. It's exactly the same way that we left it. And I'm gonna go ahead and open my terminal so that we can run the Docker commands that we need to run, and then build an image out of this file, and then we can run that image so that we can see our application in action. So I'm gonna go ahead and open my terminal, and you can see here I'm already navigated inside of the folder, so I can do an ls here so you can see everything that we worked on is in here. And the first thing we need to do is we need to build an image out of this Docker file. And to do this, I'm gonna do Docker, and then we need to do build. So we're building an image, and then we're gonna give it a tag. So we're gonna say .t and then pass in the tag name. If we don't give it a tag, then it's not gonna have a tag. It's only gonna have a number, and that number is the image ID, but it's better if you give it a name so you can, see it quickly whenever you do like a Docker images, so that you can see all your images. And to do this, I'm just gonna call it Node App Image, and then I'm gonna give it a version 1. Okay, so version 1 Node App Image. We can also do just one like this. I just like to do V so that I know which one that I'm working with. Like sometimes I'm working with multiple different images and I'm testing things, so I like to do version 1, version 2, and version 3 and things like that. But feel free to put just a number there. So Node App Image is gonna be the name of the image, and the version is gonna be V1. That's the whole tag. And then we have to specify the path of the Docker file. And to do this again, we're gonna put a dot because the Docker file is in the same directory. So Docker build -t, and then the name of the tag or the name of the image that we want, and then we specify the location of the Docker file. I'm gonna go ahead and press enter, and this can take some time because this is our first time doing it, and Docker needs to like pull images and other libraries and things like that down on this computer. So I'm gonna let this go, and then I'll come back when this is over. All right, so everything went well. It looks like everything was built. We got a warning here, so that's nothing to worry about. It's just saying that we can update to a newer version, but that's not a big deal. So we can see that the tag was created successfully and everything looks good. So I'm gonna go ahead and clear the screen, and then I'm gonna do Docker images. So that should show the list of all the images that we have. And we should have two images here. So the base image, which is the node version that we specify, and the image that we created with the name node.image, and then we give it the version or the tag v1. And that's the image ID. So if we didn't specify anything here, we would have like some opening and closing brackets in here or something like that. So we wouldn't have this nice name here that we can reference for that image. We would only have to work with this image ID. But you can see that this image was created, and now we can go ahead and run this image, and that's going to run our application. So to run the image, we can do Docker and then we do run. So we're going to run the image, and also we can give that a name. So that's going to be the name of the container. So we can do -- name. Again, if you don't pass in a name, it's just going to give you like a random name. So it's good to pass a name so that you can reference it. And you can say node app container. So that's going to be the name that I'm going to give the running container that I'm running right now off of this image. And then I want to do -d. So that's in detached mode because I want the terminal or the console come back to me after to run this image. I don't want it to hang with the process. And then another very important thing we need to do is to map the port. Remember, when we run the container, it's going to run inside of the Docker context inside of a container. So we need to have a way to access it from the local machine. And to do this, we need to map the port from the local machine over to the port inside of the container. Now, we're not specifying any specific port yet, and I'm going to show you that in a second. So what we need to do here, let's say we want to check this on 3000 on our local computer, and then we know that this is going to run on 3000 because that's the default port, and we're not passing in any port right now. And then now we have to specify the name of the image. So we can say node app image, and then I'm going to pass the version, which is v1. I'm just going to go ahead and expand it and make sure you can see everything. So I'm going to clear the screen, Docker run. We're going to give the running container a name, which is going to be node app container. We're going to run it in detached mode because we don't want the shell to hang. And then we're going to map the port on the computer. The first one is the port on the computer, and then that's the port on the container. So we're mapping the port on the container to the port on the computer, and then we're specifying the name of the image, which is the image that we just built. So if we run this command, the app should run in 3000, and you should be able to access it on our local computer using this 3000 here. So let's go ahead and press enter. And you can see that everything went well. So now to see the running container, we can go ahead and do Docker ps, and that's going to show us the running container. So you can see the name we specify, so the node app container, and you can see that the status is up 20 seconds ago. And you can see that we're mapping the port 3000 on 3000. So we know that the 3000 was picked up, so the default value for the server port was picked up from inside of the Docker file. So I'm going to go ahead and bring my browser over. So this is my browser, and you can see that I'm accessing my local computer. So that's the IP address of that computer, and then I'm accessing port 3000. So if I send this request, you can see that the application is running from inside the container and we can access it. Now there's another thing I want to show you. So if we minimize this for a second, and I'm going to bring the comment up one more time. So here we can also specify the environment variable. So for example, I can come here and then I can say -e. That's how I'm specifying environment variable. And remember, we name it server port. So we can say server_port. And then we can set this to some value that we like. For example, I'm going to set this to, for example, 9000 or 8000. Well, let's do 9000. All right, so what I'm saying here is whenever this container is going to run, it's going to run on port 9000 because that's the port that we specify as an environment variable inside of the image, as you can see here. So that means that whenever we're going to map everything, we're going to have to map port 9000, okay? Because that's going to be the port that the container is going to run on. And we need to map port 9000 to a port on our computer. So for example, I can come here and then I can say, hey, I'm going to map this to, for example, 5000, okay? So that means that the 5000 on our computer is going to be mapped to 9000 from inside the container because we're overriding the 3000 here with a 9000. When we ran it the first time, as you can see up here, we didn't specify any environment variable like we're doing here. And that's why when the container ran, it was on 3000. Well, it's still running, so it's running on 3000. But this time it's going to be running on 9000 because we're specifying this environment variable here. So it's going to override the default value that we have from inside the container. And then we're mapping 5000 on our host computer to 9000 because we know that this 9000 is where the container is going to be running. So I just wanted to show you how when you pass an environment variable, then everything becomes a little bit more flexible, and you can see how this is going to come in handy when we have different environment, prod and dev and test, and we can pass different ports if we want to. So I'm going to go ahead and run this command, and you can see that it gives me an error because I have to give this container a different name. So I'm going to press the up arrow key, and then I'm going to go over here, and let's say we're going to name this 2. Okay, so node app container 2, and then run it again, and you can see now everything went well. So I'm going to clear the screen and then do Docker PS. And you can see now we have 2 containers running. So the first one, the one at the bottom, so the Docker container, you can see that it's mapping port 3000 on 3000. And I just showed you that on the browser. But for the second one, we're mapping 5000. Now you can see 9000. So it picked up the environment variable and it overrides the default of 3000 that we have specified as the default. So now the container is running on 9000 and we're mapping 9000 to 5000 here. So I'm going to bring back the browser and now I can duplicate this tab. So I'm going to duplicate it. So the 3000 is still running. If I put this down a little bit, if I go to 5000, as you can see here, it should also give me the same result. So I'm going to go here, change this to 5. Okay, so now we're going to go to 5000. And if I click on that, you can see we get the same result, and I can refresh it as many times as I want. You can see that we still get the same response, and I can do the same here, refresh, we have the same response. So we have the same application running on 2 different containers using 2 different ports. Now we can run the same image and the same port, but we map a different port from our local computer. And what that means is that if we're going to run 2 containers, they can run on the same port because they don't have any communication with each other. Like they're not going to conflict. But I just wanted to show you how you can use the environment variable so that you can pass different environment variables, different key value pairs that you want to pass to your Docker file or to your running containers. And that makes everything a lot easier whenever you're working with different environments and things like that. Now, the last thing I want to show you, if I can maximize this browser and zoom in a little bit, is if we go ahead here and try to go to patient. So I'm going to do / and then do patients, right? So we're trying to access patients. So if I send this request, you can see that we get an error. That's because we don't have any connection to the database, because we don't have any database running. So whenever we send this request, it's going to try to access a database, the patients DB database, because that's what the query is saying. So it's not going to find it, and that's why it's giving us this error. So what we're going to be doing next is working on a Docker Compose file, which is going to allow us to combine multiple different services together inside of one file. And what this is going to allow us to do is, instead of having to run like a command like this, if I clear the screen a little, so you can see that this command is really long. And if we were to run another container, for example, the MySQL container, then we would have to run another command again that's going to be like super long like this. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to use something called a Docker Compose file, and we're going to put these 2 services together, and with one command, we're going to go ahead and start both services, and everything's going to run very smoothly. So now we know that the Docker file is good because we didn't get any error. We're able to build this Docker file, and we're able to run the application using Docker run and then passing in the name of the image that we created off of this Docker file. So we know that all this part is working. So now we're just going to take this service and then create another service, which is going to be the MySQL service, put them together. And to do this, we're going to use a Docker Compose file, and then we're going to run those 2 services together off of this Docker Compose file with just run command. So let's go back to my Windows computer and let's go ahead and work on the Docker Compose file. Let's go ahead and work on the Docker Compose file. So I'm going to go ahead and create another file here. So I'm going to do docker-compose.yaml. Okay, so that's another YAML file. Now I have the MySQL Docker Hub open, and I'm going to show you guys what that looks like. So this is the official image for MySQL. So I'm going to scroll down. You can go over to this page and you can check it out for yourself. You can see here they're mentioning some of the versions and stuff, some of the configurations. And then if you scroll down, if you want to do a quick one, you can run a container of MySQL really quickly, like if you just run this command, and some other ways to use the command line with MySQL. But what we're interested in is this part right here. So this is like a little bit of a snapshot of what we're going to be doing, but we're going to come back to this in a second. But I do want to show you some of the environment variables that we need to set. So you can see that we can also pass environment variables such as the database, the root password. You can pass a user and a password for that user. So we're going to be using these environment variables so that we can configure our Docker Compose file. So let's scroll up here, and I'm going to go ahead and copy all this. So just so we can have a starting point, and let's go back to the editor, and I'm going to go ahead and paste that here. So I'm going to fix this a little, and we're not going to call this DB. Let's call it MySQL DB, for example. And the image is going to be MySQL, but we also need to specify the version. So here I'm going to say 8.0. Remember, it's very important that you specify this version, because if you just put latest here or you don't put anything, then it's going to take the latest and you never know what can happen to MySQL. We're going to leave this command. This is going to set the MySQL default password plugin for us. And this is pretty important. So we're going to keep this here. And for the restart, I'm just going to change this to always, and I'm going to say unless stopped. Okay, so we're not gonna always restart this. We're only gonna do that whenever this is stopped. Okay, so if it's stopped, then go ahead and rerun it. And then another thing I want to set is some values. So I'm gonna say volumes, and then here what I want to do is I want to point to our file. So here the volume is an array, so we have to put a dash, and then I want to point to my file. So I'm gonna say dot / and I want to go to db init and then / init.sql. Okay, so remember we need to mount this file somewhere so that when we run this container, then it can run our script. Okay, so just so you remember, this is the folder that I'm referencing, so the db init folder, and then inside of this folder we have the init.sql. So this needs to run on the MySQL database server so that we can have our patients table and our database and everything. So it's important that we do this step right here, and I'm gonna mount this to a very specific location. So to specify the location, you put a colon and then you specify the location, and this is gonna be docker -entry point -init db -d, and then we need to put a /0 _init.sql. Okay, so this is something that you just have to know, and if you mount anything inside of this init.sql file, then it's gonna run it on startup so that we can have, like I said, all of this information in the script be ran inside of the container so that we can create our database as well as our table and everything. So this is an important step. Don't forget to do that. Otherwise, when you run the application, even if everything is running, when you try to like create a new patient or something, then it's not going to work because it's not going to find the database and the table. And then I also need to keep a copy of everything. So here I'm going to go to my home folder. So I'm going to put $ and then home. So that's going to specify my home folder, and I'm going to save everything to another folder called database. Okay, so database, you can call this whatever you want. And I'm going to mount this to var /lib /MySQL. Okay, so MySQL is going to save all of the data inside of this var /lib, not live, so lib and then MySQL. So we're mapping this on the local computer, and since I'm going to be running this again on my Linux computer, then this home here is going to give me the home path of whoever is logged in on the computer whenever this is running. So it's going to map this MySQL folder inside of our home folder inside of a folder called database, and that's why it's going to stock everything. So that way whenever we stop the container and we rerun it again, we don't lose the data. So this is really important, mostly when you're working with database, because you don't want to lose your data every single time. And then I'm going to specify some ports. So I'm going to say port, and this is an array again, and I'm going to specify the port that I want to map. So this is 3306. So I'm going to keep the same port. So I'm mapping 3306 on my computer to 3306 inside of the container. And we can expose that as well, even though I think it's going to expose it by default. But just to be safe, we're going to go ahead and expose that. So we're going to say 3306. Okay, so also an array. So we have to pass it in with a dash, and then we put as many as we want because it's an array or a list. So this is coming together nicely, and I'm going to collapse this. So let's go back and grab some of those other environment variables. So the one that I'm going to look for here is the MySQL database. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and then go back to the app, and I'm going to come here and then paste it. And I need to type this over once because in YAML file, the spacing is very important. And for this, we need to pass in the same name that we have in here. Okay, so just in case that something happened here, we know we will have this database anyways. So let's go ahead and pass it in here, patientsdb. So we didn't really have to do this because if this script is run, then it's going to create the database, but we have if not exist. So that shouldn't be a problem or anything like that. So just to be safe, we're going to pass in the default database, which is the patientsdb. And then we need the MySQL user. So I'm going to copy part of this and then go down here. And this is going to be user. So the user here is going to be admin. So that's the same user that we're specifying inside of here. Okay, so if we go back to the environment variable, you can see that we're specifying, well, I'm using the root user here, but that's not a very good practice. So we're going to create another user, and then we collapse this. We're going to create this user called admin, and that's the user that we're going to use to log in and do everything that we need to do. And I'm going to copy this line and then paste it. We need a password just for the user, so MySQL password, and that's gonna be the same password, so let me in. And I'm gonna put the same for the root user, so let me in. And some other environment variable that we can pass here, there's one called service tag, so we can do service underscore tags, and then we can give this, for example, prod. Let me do lowercase prod. And we can also pass a name. So by default, it's going to be using this name for the service, which is what we're doing here. We're giving this name for the service. If you want this to be different for the name of the service, then you can come down here and then specify the service name. So we're going to say service underscore name, and then we can give it a different name. In this case, I'm going to keep it to MySQL, which is the same, but I just want you to know that this exists. So MySQL DB. And then one last thing we need to do that's very important. We need to determine a network. So here I'm going to say networks, and that's also an array. and I'm going to create a network called internal net. Okay, so internal network. So this is important because we have to put this MySQL service on the same network as the Node app so that they can communicate with each other. So make sure you have a network defined here, and while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and define this network. So down there, I'm going to say networks, and then I'm going to pass in the same name, so internal net, and then I'm going to give it a driver, which is going to be a bridge. Okay, by default it's always going to be bridge, but I just want to specify this just so you can see it. So we want a bridge network, and this is a little bit over the networking part of Docker, and that can be a little bit complicated, so I'm not gonna dive too much into Docker networks. But all you need to know is that when we specify the network here, we're defining a network. So it's going to create this network and put this service inside of this network, so that whenever we create another service, if we mention that service to be on this network, then they should be able to communicate with each other because they're on the same network. So that's the idea. So that looks good. We can actually run this Docker file, and it should be able to create the MySQL service or the MySQL container for us, and we should be able to connect to it using these credentials that we're specifying here. But like I said, we want to put both services inside of the same file, which is the whole point of Docker Compose, because it allows you to run multiple different containers with one command or bring them down with one command. So it makes it very convenient to run different containers instead of having to, for instance, if I go up here, instead of having to run these long commands like this. So this is really error prone, so we don't want to do that, and that's one of the problems that Docker Compose solves. Let's go back to the code. So that looks good. What we're gonna do next is we're gonna put the next service. So you can see here we only have one service, which is the MySQL DB. So that's the MySQL service. Now we have to use the Docker file, so the Docker file that we have here, to create another service inside of the Docker Compose, so that when we run this Docker Compose file, it can actually run this MySQL service and also run our application, which has this Docker file here. So I'm going to collapse this again one more time, and then I'm going to go ahead and just copy this service. So I'm going to collapse it and then select everything and then copy it, and I'm going to expand it again, go all the way to the bottom, press enter. All right, so I need to tab once. Remember, spacing is very important in a YAML file. So just to make sure that I'm under the same level as the MySQL service, because we're going to create another service. And I'm going to go ahead and paste the code here. All right, so first thing is we need to change this name, and I'm going to just change this to like Node App, and I can also give this a name, which I didn't do before. So here we can specify a container name. So we can say container underscore name, and we can call this, for example, Node App Container, okay, because that's what it is. So we can also specify this as well for the MySQL service. So let's go up here and just paste this here, and I'm just gonna call it MySQL Container. So I'm gonna copy this part, oops, Control Z, copy, and paste it here. Okay, so we're gonna call this container MySQL Container. Container name, I have a typo here, so it's supposed to be container name, and I'm gonna go ahead and change it here as well. So container name, and the image, we're not gonna need it because remember, we're building this image, or we're gonna build this container off of this Docker image. And to do this, what we have to do here, we're gonna say build, and we're gonna put a dot here. So we're saying, hey, we're building a Docker file and it's in the same directory. So we just put a dot, and we can also tag the image. So here I'm gonna say image, and then I'm gonna tag it. So I can pass in something here. I can say something like Node App, and then let's say V1. Okay, or we can put like 1 or something like that. But in my case, I'm gonna do V1. Okay, so Node App version 1. So that's gonna be the name of the image after the image is built. As you can see here, that's what we're gonna be doing. So that's gonna be the name of the container, the name of the service. We're gonna build the Docker file, and we're gonna give the image that comes out of building this Docker file, we're gonna give it this name of Node App with a tag of V1. We don't need the restart, we don't need the volume, so I'm gonna remove these two. The port, we know we can pass in 3000, so we're gonna say 3000. We're mapping this again to 3000. We can change that if we want, so feel free to do that. And also exposing 3000, so I'm gonna expose 3000. And then I need to pass something that's also very important, which is depends underscore on. Okay, so we're technically telling Docker that there's another service this service depends on, and here we can pass in a list, and I'm gonna pass in the MySQL DB. Okay, so that's the name of the service. We can either use this name here, so if we specify a different name here, we would have to use that name, or we can use the name that's up here. So that's the name of the service. So we're specifying that this service, so the Node App service or this container, depends on the MySQL DB, which is another service that we have here. And the reason we're doing that is because we want this service to be up and running before we try to run the service, because we know that there's a dependency on that MySQL service so that the app can run. So we're technically saying, hey, this service depends on this service up there, which is the MySQL service. And then we're going to specify some of the environment variable that we have for the Node app. And if we remember, if we go back here and we go inside of the .env file, we have all of these properties that we have set for this application. So we can just copy everything here and go back here. And for these environment variables, I'm going to change all these ones because we don't need them. Those are MySQL specific. And let me see if I can type everything over. All right. And then I'm going to select all the equal sign. I'm going to do Control D and change everything to a colon. Okay, because that's how that works. All right. So the host is going to be the name of the service. Okay. So that's the host. That's the name of the service. That's the MySQL DB, which is what we're specifying up here. Okay, so we're going to keep that as the host. So that's the host of MySQL. The user, we're specifying the user here. So we have admin as the user. So we're going to pass this user here. I'm going to scroll down. We're not going to be using the root user. We're going to use this admin user. Password, I'm going to put this in quote. The database is PatientsDB, which we're also specifying up here. So PatientsDB. The port 3306, you can see that's what we're exposing up here. And that's what we're mapping. The server port, we can override it. Remember, we have the server port already inside of the Docker file. So remember, we have the server port here. But like I said, we can override it with the Docker compose file as well, which I'm doing here with the 5000. You can change this to whatever you want. I'm just using 5000 for no reason. Service tags, again, we can put prod, and then the service name we have to change, or we can remove it if you don't want to. But I can put a service name here. I can say Node App Service. Okay, so if we need to use this service and any other service, then we would have to use this name the same way that we're doing up here. So, okay, so we give this a name of MySQL DB, and that's the name that we're using here for the depends on, and that's what we're using as the host as well. And lastly, we have the networks. So the network is supposed to be the same because we want them to be on the same network so that they can communicate with each other. And I define the network here, as you can see here at the bottom. So let me remove that one line at the bottom, and everything looks good. If I don't have any typos or anything, everything should work. So now I'm gonna go ahead and go back to my Linux machine, and then we're gonna go ahead and give this a try. So I'm back in my Linux computer again because that's where I have Docker installed. I don't have it installed on my Windows computer. I just keep it on my Linux computer because it's a lot more convenient when I have to run certain commands and things like that. So I'm back on my Linux, and there's a couple of things that I want to fix. So the first one is a typo that I have in the Docker compose file. So if we scroll up here, you can see here I misspelled Docker. So I'm gonna remove this and then move it over here. The K. Okay, so make sure you fix this typo. If you followed along or if you grab the code, then you make sure that you have this spelled correctly. And another thing I noticed is you notice that we're mapping here port 3000, which means from inside of the container we're gonna be looking for this port to be exposed, but down here I'm setting this port to 5000. So what's gonna happen is whenever this Docker compose file is gonna read this Docker file, it's gonna override this 3000 with this environment variable. Let me close this. So it's going to override this 3000 with 5000, and you remember we're exposing 3000, so that's not going to work. So we can either remove this altogether or we just change it to 3000. Okay, so it's going to override it, but it's going to override it with the same value, which is what we're exposing here, and that's what we're mapping here as well. Now you can always do any different port that you want here. The only thing is you have to remember that whenever you change this port, you have to also change it here and also change the mapping here on the second one here. So this is saying that from inside of the container, we're going to override the port, which for now would be 3000, but we're going to pass in this environment variable, and it's going to change it to, let's say, what it was, 5000. So in this case, then we can't expose 3000, or even if we expose it, there is no processes running that is exposing 3000. So it's not going to work. So make sure that if you're going to override this server port, which is an environment variable from inside of the Docker file, as you can see here, then make sure you change this expose to the same port, and also the mapping for the second one. Remember, the first one is the mapping from the computer. So as long as this port is open on the computer, we're good to go. But this second one is the one that we're mapping to the container. So you have to make sure that this is also changed. So if this is 5000, then this has to be 5000, and also this has to be 5000. But I'm going to keep it to 3000, which is going to override the 3000 that we already have, or I can just omit it altogether, like remove that line altogether. If you had to build build the Docker file and then run the image, then you would be able to pass in this environment variable, which is what I showed you guys how to do. So make sure you fix this and also the typo in Docker, and then you should be good to go. So what I'm going to do now is just open my terminal and then run the Docker compose command. And the Docker compose command is going to take all this configuration, build the images, and then run all the containers. So let me go ahead and open my terminal. And as you can see here, I've already navigated to the NodeJs API folder, and I can do an ls here just so that you can see the files that we have. So the same file that I just showed you that we have in VS Code. The only thing that's different here from last time is the name of the computer, because I changed the name of the computer. I did an update and then I also changed the name of the computer, but this is not important. So now what we're going to do, since we have the Docker compose file, we can just do docker-compose. Also, another thing I want to say, like I didn't talk much about having Docker and Docker compose install. So make sure you watch tutorials or whatever you can find, and then make sure you have Docker compose and Docker install on your computer. So I know I didn't mention that a lot, but you need to have Docker compose and then Docker install on your computer. So we're going to invoke the Docker compose command by just typing out Docker compose, and then we're going to pass up, which means we're going to build stuff and run stuff. And then we're going to do D for detach, which we've already seen. And then we're going to pass in -- build, and this is going to build the Docker file that we have. Remember, we're specifying that, if I can scroll up a little bit. So for this container, you can see that for the build, we're passing in the current directory, which means that it's going to look in the same directory or in the same folder for this Docker file. And that's what I'm passing in this -- build, so that you can understand that we have a Docker file that we need to build. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. Now, this is going to take some time because I don't have the images. I don't have the base images. So that's going to take some time to download all these images from the internet. So the base images, and then create our images and then run the container. So this is going to take some time. So I'm going to go ahead and run it, and then I'm going to fast forward the video so you can watch it. It's going to be very fun to watch as everything is being downloaded, and then I'll come back when this is over. So let me go ahead and run this command and then let it finish. So everything completed. So I'm going to go ahead and clear the screen. Now, if I do Docker PS, we should have two containers running. As you can see, we have both of them running. So we have the Node application, so the Node app container, and then we have the MySQL container, as you can see here, running on 3306. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my browser. I have it open in my other screen, and I'm going to bring it over. And as you can see here, when we send a GET request to patients, then we get this. So that means that the application is running and it was able to look into the database and it didn't find anything. And then we get the empty data for the array because we don't have any patients yet. And if I try to go to / for example, some random number, then I press enter, then we get the 404 not found because we didn't find any patient by that ID. So let's go ahead and see if we can insert a new patient so that we can see this in action. So I'm going to go ahead and open Postman, and I'm going to create a new request. So this is going to go to http://192.168.1.160. So that's the IP address for this computer. And then we want to go to 3000. And then again, we want to go to it's coming up here. I'm just gonna select it. So we're gonna go to / patients, and I have two HTTP here. So I'm gonna remove one of them. So if we send this request again, which is gonna be a GET request this time, we should get the same result. So we get the OK, and then we have an empty array, as you can see here. So let me go ahead and duplicate this tab, and we're gonna send a post request this time. It's still gonna go to patients, but here we're gonna pass in the body, which is gonna be in JSON. So raw text and then JSON, and then I'm gonna pass in some JSON here that I've already typed out because I don't want to type all of this in front of you. So we're gonna put in this patient. So first name, last name, email address, diagnosis, phone, status, and then some image URL. So if we go ahead and send this request, we should get a 201, which is gonna be the created, and we should have something in the database that we can look at. So let's go ahead and send this request. And as you can see, we get the 201 created. So we know that this patient was created in the database. And now if we go back to get patient and we send this request again, you can see that we get the data back, which is what we're expecting. And if I bring the browser back again, and then this time we're gonna go back, send this request and refresh the page, you can see that if I maximize this, we get the same result. So we get the same result. We get this patient with ID 1. And if we pass in 1 here, so I'm gonna say /1, press enter. Now we can see that we got just that one patient. So everything is working. And if you want to test this further, you can can go ahead and test it. And I want you to take a look at the logs a little bit. So let me bring over my terminal, and to look at the log, you can do Docker logs, and then you pass in the name of the container. So let's say we're going to take a look at the node app container logs, and then press enter, and you can see that we get all the logs that we're expecting. So incoming request from the host computer, which is 160. So everything seems to be working. And again, you can go ahead and test this further, but I just wanted to show you this in action. So now the only thing we have to do is to have some server on the internet that's going to have Docker and Docker Compose, and then we can just run the same command and then deploy the application. You can see I can exit of this terminal. So if I type in exit and exit again so that I can leave this, and the application is still working. So I can send a request. You can see everything is still working because it's a running container. So nothing is going to stop. We get an error here because we're passing in the same email here. So if I change this Henry to Henry like 25, and I send this request again, you can see that it's created again. And if we send this request to, you can see now we have like 2 patients. So everything is working, and this is considered a deployment. In the future, I will show you how to do a different kind of deployment with CI pipeline, because really in real world, we don't do deployment like manually like that. But this is a small project, and I want you to have something running on the internet, at least on AWS, which is really cheap, or anywhere you can get some free server where you can deploy some application and install some software. Then you should be able to deploy your application that way. But I just want to take you from 0 to 100. So I introduce you to TypeScript. We look at the language, then we use the language to build something, and we didn't stop there. We also take what we build and deploy it on a live server. So right now it's running on my computer, which is on my network, so nobody else can access it. But I'm going to show you how you can take that same application and then deploy it on any other server on the internet so that you can share the link with your friends or your family. And the only thing you really need is to have Docker and Docker Compose installed on that remote server. You don't need to have any other software installed. You just need to have Docker, and that's the power of Docker. So as long as this computer has Docker and Docker Compose installed, then you can deploy the application with the same command. And then after you run the command and you verify that everything is working, you can just close out of this terminal or however you're accessing that remote server, and then your application is deployed. So that's why I'm choosing Docker, and I'm choosing it that way to deploy the application. But really in the real world, you would have to set up a CI pipeline, and then every time you like make a push to the master branch on your code repository, whether that would be GitHub or somewhere else, then it's going to trigger a whole chain of events, and eventually your app is going to be deployed. And then whatever the new version is, that's what you're going to see when you access the application. But that's a more expensive and a more complicated setup. But I'm going to have this in the next course that I'm going to have. So I'm going to show you how to set up a CI pipeline. For this course, I'm just going to show you how to deploy it using Docker on a remote server, just so that you can see something in action, and then you can share something with your friends, and then you can show them, you know, how you build an API or something like that. So in the next lectures, we're just going to go into AWS, spin up a little server, install Docker and Docker Compose, move all of our files over to that server, run the same command, and then the app will be deployed. So I'm logged into the AWS console, and this is a new console. I just switched to this new view that they showed me the option for. So maybe yours might not look like that, but it's going to be the same process. So don't worry too much about it. And also you can get your cloud or your remote server from any other services. You can use Linode or Microsoft, anywhere else where you can get a free server online. You just need to have a public IP address, and then we can access the application from there. So what I need to do is I need to create a computer on AWS. AWS calls this an EC2 instance or an EC2, and you can see it here, or you can go here and type it in, or you can click services, then it should show you like this compute here. You click it, then it gives you this menu, and I'm seeing this for the first time because this is a new view, and you can click EC2 instance here, and that should take you to the console for EC2 instance. And you can see that I don't have anything running, and I can click on launch instance and then click here, and we're gonna stay in the free tier. So you can see here it says free tier eligible, so we can just keep this one and then click on select, and we're gonna stay again in the T2 micro. So we don't want to pay for anything here because we're just doing a deploy as an example. So I'm gonna click on next for the configuration, and this is a very important page for the configure instance. So make sure you don't skip this page because there's a script that we have to put in so that we can have Docker install. So as you can see in this box down there, I'm gonna put in a script, and then I'm gonna walk you through it, tell you exactly what the script is doing. But essentially what we're trying to do is to just install Docker and Docker Compose on the computer as AWS is launching the computer. So I've copied the script, so I'm just gonna go ahead and paste it, and I'm gonna make the box a little bit bigger, scroll up a little bit. So what we're doing here is we're saying that we're using the bash shell because we know that's going to be installed on the computer, and then we're updating the system, and then we're installing Docker, we're starting the Docker service, and then we're adding the EC2 user. So that's the user by default that you're going to have with this EC2 instance. We're adding this Docker group to this user so that we don't have to keep using sudo whenever we're passing in some Docker command. And then this check config here is making sure that whenever the computer is restarted, so the system is restarted, that the Docker service comes up automatically, or it's just gonna start the Docker service as well. And then here we're downloading some scripts, so that's gonna go inside of the USR local bin, and then the name of the file is gonna be Docker Compose, and then we're giving the execute permission on this file. So that's gonna allow us to use Docker Compose, because again, Docker Compose is like an extension of Docker. So essentially we're just installing Docker and Docker Compose, and then give our EC2 user permission, or adding that user to the Docker group. We know that's gonna exist once you install Docker. So make sure you don't skip this part, otherwise you're just gonna have to install everything manually, and that's fine, but it's not very convenient. So just for convenience, I'm gonna also give you the script, so you can just put it in whenever you need to install Docker and Docker Compose on an EC2 instance. And everything else can be the same, so everything else is gonna be the default. And then we're gonna click on next for the storage. So the default storage is fine, we don't need anything more than that. And then I'm gonna add some tag, which I'm not gonna add this time. And then we're gonna configure security group. Now security groups, they're really just ports that you want to open on your computer. So you can see that we have SSH because we need SSH so that we can connect to the computer using SSH. But I'm also gonna open, let's see here. So what I want is a custom TCP rule, and then that's gonna go through 3000, because we know that our application is running on 3000. And then we're gonna say anyone can access this 3000 port that is gonna be open, because it's an API that we're building. So we want everyone to be able to access it. So make sure you don't miss this step. We're opening port 22 so that we can connect to it remotely, and we're also exposing port 3000 on the host, so that whenever we send a request to 3000, then it can accept the request because it's listening on this port. And that's a TCP rule, which is a custom TCP rule that we're adding here. Don't skip this step because it's really important. And then we're gonna click on review and launch, and here we have a summary of everything that we put in. And then I'm gonna click on launch, and now it's asking me to select a key pair. So I'm gonna choose to create a new key pair, because I don't know if I have one on my computer yet. And then I'm just gonna call it node server key. So that's gonna be the key pair that we're gonna use as our identification, so that we can access the server remotely. And then I'm gonna download this key pair, and it's gonna go into my home. So I'm gonna go to home and then save. So this key pair is saved on my home directory on my computer, and I'm just gonna click on launch instances. So this is gonna go and provision the computer. It's just gonna give us a public IP address, and then we're just gonna be able to connect to it. You can see the status is pending, so I'm gonna change the name here a little. So this is gonna be node server. All right, so we give it a name of node server, and you can see the public IP address that we have here, and that's what we're gonna use to connect. So now the instance is running, we can connect to it, and all we need to do, like I mentioned before, is just move the file and then run the same command, and then the application should be running on this IP address on port 3000. And that's what we're gonna be doing next. So I'm back in my terminal again, and there's one thing we need to do before we can connect. And also, by the way, you can connect using the browser. So if you see this button here, it's gonna open this tab here, and you can connect online. Like you can click here and it's gonna connect. But I don't like to use the browser to connect. I like to use my terminal. So I'm gonna go back and bring the terminal back up. I want to change the permission on the key, because we don't want it to be too open. And to do this, I'm gonna do sudo, so elevated permission, change mode, and then I want to give this 400, and then we need to put this on the, let me see what I have here. What we're looking for is this key here, which is the node server key. So let me just clear everything and then do node server key. Okay, so we're gonna change the permission to 400, press enter, put in your password, and then the permission should be changed. Okay, so now if we do ls-lh and then we pass in the node server key pen, then you can see that we can only read it. So now we can connect to the remote server, and to connect, we're gonna use SSH. So we're gonna do SSH, and then the user is EC2-user, and then we're gonna do add, and then we're gonna pass in the IP address. So let's go ahead and just copy this, select this so we can see the detail. Well, I didn't want to do that. All right, so let's copy this. I'm gonna bring back the terminal and then paste. So that should take us inside of the remote server, but there's one thing we need to add is the identity key. So we're gonna do -i for identity, and then we're gonna do node server key. Okay, so we're passing in our identity, which is like our password or something like that. And then I'm gonna press enter. Then my computer is gonna ask me if I trust this connection, and I'm gonna say yes. And you can see now we're inside of the computer, which is the remote computer. And here I can do Docker PS just to see that Docker is installed. You can see that we don't have anything, and I can do Docker-compose, and you can see that it gives me something back, which is just a list of commands if I want to learn Docker, because it's not understanding what I'm trying to do here. So we know that Docker Compose is installed and Docker is installed. So I'm gonna clear the screen and then just leave. So now I'm back on my computer, and now I just need to move the files over and then run the same command again. So to do this, we're gonna do secure copy, so SCP, and we want to do this recursively because we're copying a folder. So we're gonna do -r, and we need to pass in the identity, so -i, and then we're gonna pass in the name, so node server key. And and then we need to pass in the folder that we're trying to copy over. So we're going to say NodeJs API. So that's the name of the folder. And then we need to pass in the computer. So let me scroll up here and see if I can use some of this code. So what we're looking for is this right here. So EC2 user at the IP address. So let me copy this, clear the screen again, and then paste this here. Okay, so we're saying, hey, we're gonna copy recursively because it's a folder. Here's our identity key. So that's like our password or whatever. And then here's where we wanna copy everything over. And specifically, we wanna put everything inside of the home folder. So we're gonna put a colon, the tilde, and then a /. Okay, just to specify that we want to put this in the home folder. And then press enter. And you can see everything is copied over. Now, one last thing I have to mention, you can see that in the list of files that I've copied over, I don't have the Nodes module. So if I go inside of the NodeJs API folder, I do an ls here, you can see that I don't have the Nodes module. I removed that folder because it's too large. Okay, so make sure you remove it before you copy everything over. So let me go back, clear the screen, and then I'm gonna run this command again so that I can log into the remote computer. So SSH, and then I'm already inside of that computer. And if I do ls, you can see that I have my folder, which is the NodeJs API folder. I can go inside of that folder. All right, and ls, you can see I have everything in there. And then now I just have to run the same command. So I'm gonna do docker -compose, and then up. We want it in detach mode, so -d, and then we want to build a Docker file, so --build, and then we're just gonna run this. Again, this is gonna take some time because it's the first time I'm running this, so it's gonna pull everything from the internet. That can take some time. I'll come back when this is over. So I'm gonna go ahead and press enter. And as you can see, everything is completed and we have our 2 containers running. So I'm going to clear the screen and then do docker ps so that we can see the 2 containers. You can see they're both running. So now we can access our application anywhere in the world using the IP address. So I'm going to minimize this and grab the IP address. So I'm going to copy this and then I'm going to open my browser and I'm going to bring it over. And as you can see here, if I zoom in a little, you can see that we have the application running on that IP address and then the port is 3000 and we get our welcome message. So I'm going to make this a little bigger just so you guys can see this. All right, so now if we go to /patients, so /patients, enter, you can see that we get our response. So let's go ahead and see if we can enter a new patient in the database. And to do this, we're going to use Postman again. So let me bring up Postman. All right, so the request is going to be the same. So the body of the request, if we do raw and then we do JSON, and well, this is the get request. So we're still going to keep the get request and we want to go to the post request and go to the body. The body is still the same. So we can still send this request again. And I'm going to change this to just henry@gmail.com. Okay, so we're gonna send this request and the only thing that's gonna change is the address here. So let me go ahead and just copy the address again. So minimize this and I can just copy this whole thing, bring back Postman, and I'm just gonna change everything here. So HTTP, whatever the IP address is or whatever IP address you have, port 3000, and then again we're gonna go to /patients. It's a post request and then we're gonna pass in the body of the request. So if we send this, you can see that we get the 201 created and we get the data back. So now if we go back here and we have to change this again, so change the whole thing. This is a get request this time, send it, and we don't have any body. And you can see that we get the response back. So our application is running inside of a container on a remote server and we can access it anywhere in the world using that IP address. And we can check it out in the browser again. So if I bring back the browser and now if I refresh, you can see that we have the data back. So just for the heck of it, let's just put another request in here. So I'm going to change the email to like 25 and change this name as well. So I'm going to change this to something else. Let's also change the last name. So I'm going to say Alexander and then send this request again. Okay, it was created. Bring the browser back, refresh. Now you can see we have 2 patients. So we have patient with ID 2 and the patient with ID 1. And again, feel free to test everything, but I already know that all the functionalities should be working as well. So if I go to patient 1, I get patient 1. If I go to patient 2, I get patient 2. And if I go to some random patient that doesn't exist, then I'm gonna get the 404 not found. So you can go ahead and test, you know, the update and the delete as well, but I already know that everything should be working. So I'll leave that up to you. So the application is pretty much deployed and it's running on a live server. And just to demonstrate what I told you earlier with the terminal, that you can close everything and the application should still be running. So let me open back the terminal and you can see that we're still inside of the remote server. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out. So I'm going to say exit and I'm going to close this terminal altogether. So I close the terminal and you can see that everything is still working because it's a Docker container that's working. It's an isolated process. We can close the terminal. So you can consider this an actual deployment. But what I wanted to show you probably in a future course is how you can use the services offered by AWS, and you can find almost the same services in any other cloud provider. But I'm going to show you how to set up a CDCI pipeline with GitHub and AWS ECR and ECS, Elastic Container Service and Elastic Container Repository. And what I'm going to show you is how you can build a CDCI pipeline. And what that means is that whenever we push the code to a repository or we trigger some event, then we start a whole chain of events where we build the application, we deploy the application, and all we have to do is just refresh the page where the application is running so that we can see the changes that we made after we commit the code. We don't have to do any of this. All of this will be automated. So we push the code to GitHub, and then once the code is pushed to GitHub, then the code is also pushed to the repository. A Docker image is built, this image is pulled, and then we run a container out of that image and the application is running again. And we didn't have to do anything. We didn't have to move any files or anything like that. But this is something that I'm going to save for another course, because just the deployment alone is already taking us a little bit far away from TypeScript. But I just wanted to show you that whenever you're learning something, you're not just learning the language, you're learning it with an objective. Like there's an end goal that you want to reach, and that's usually going to be deploying the application and have it running live, because ultimately that's the whole point. You want to have something that is usable and that people can use, that is online and anybody can use it. So that's why I wanted to show you that, just so that you understand the journey that you're on. So becoming a developer, like a software developer, a full stack developer, there's a lot to learn, and you can't just ignore parts of it. You have to at least dabble in almost every part of the software development process, and that includes deployment. So I just wanted you to understand that. But again, I didn't really have to make this part of the course, but I felt like it was necessary. So I hope you learned a lot. The next thing we're going to be doing is we're going to see if we can build a front-end application using TypeScript again. So this time is another time again to take a break. So if you want to take a break to assimilate everything we've seen, then this is a good time, because in the next module, what I'm going to be showing you is a different ecosystem that is also using TypeScript, and I think it's going to be very valuable to you. So take a break, have some coffee or some juice or some water, whatever you want to do, take a walk, and then come back to continue the course. So we build an entire backend application using TypeScript and Node.js. Another technology, in this case framework, that I think is worth mentioning here when talking about TypeScript is the Angular framework. Now, Angular is by Google, and it's one of the most popular JavaScript framework or web framework that you can find out there. And it's one of my favorite when it comes to working with the front end. Now, I don't want to get into the whole war between which framework is better, either Vue or React or Angular, because I think that whenever you're going to make a decision which framework you want to use or which technologies you want to use for your application, it's really going to come down to your goals and what you're trying to do. And in my case, I've used both Angular and React.js as well, and I like both of them. I use both of them depending on the project. I haven't used Vue yet, but that's not because I have something against Vue. I just haven't had time to actually learn Vue and then start playing with it. But this aside, I think that Angular is worth mentioning whenever you're talking about TypeScript and front-end development. So since this is a TypeScript course and I'm actually showing you the language in practice, so I think that it's a good idea to use Angular and then build some front-end application, and we're gonna make this application talk with the backend application that we built. Now, you can also use TypeScript with React.js or I think Vue, but you can use TypeScript with React.js as well. And I believe in large applications, this is the preferred way to go, because you want to make sure that you catch as many bugs as possible in your code during development. But Angular itself, you have to use TypeScript. Like, it comes with TypeScript, so you have to go with TypeScript. And this is why I'm choosing it. So it's not really about choosing Angular for any other reason. It's just because it comes with TypeScript by default, you have to use TypeScript. So I'm just showing you, another application that is a front-end application that makes use of TypeScript, and I think it's going to be valuable to you. So it's going to be a little bit challenging to talk about TypeScript and Angular and not focus on some of the Angular concepts itself. So I will try to focus these lectures on the TypeScript aspect, but it's really hard to work with Angular and not talk about some of the Angular concepts. And I'm going to show you what I mean once we get into the application. Now, Angular comes with its own CLI, and this is called the Angular CLI. And you can see here, you can install it with npm, and you can use it to pretty much manage your application, to do pretty much almost everything you need to do, like create the application, run the application locally, build the application, deploy the application, etc. And you can see here, if we scroll down, they have a list of all of these commands that you can use, and they go even deeper. For example, if we click on this generate here, you can see that there's many different things you can do with just the generate command. So let me go back, and I want to scroll up and show you how we can quickly create an application using the Angular CLI, which is just their command line interface. So you can see here, you can just do ng new, and then you pass in the name of the project, and then you can run ng serve just to run a local development environment. So that's what we're going to be doing, just so that we can spin up a quick Angular application. And my goal with this is to build like a patient board that looks like this. So we're going to have a list of patients, and we're going to have information about the patients. Now, this is just a very tiny example, but I just want you to have something concrete so that we can check something out in the browser. But you can see here that I'm just serving this HTML file. So this is not an Angular application. It's just a simple HTML file. And then in the next tab, I have our API. So I start the API again on a computer on my network, which is the 160 this time. So we're going to be making HTTP calls to this API, which is the one that we built in the course, so that we can present something like this on the page. And to do this, we're going to be using Angular, and Angular uses TypeScript. So that's just a way for me to try to connect TypeScript in the front end, and I'm using Angular to do that. But again, like I said, you can use TypeScript with React, and I'm pretty sure you can do that with Vue as well. So what we're going to be doing is just creating an Angular application, and then see if we can make some HTTP requests, and then get the data, and then present the data like this. So it's going to be a very small application, but at least it'll give you a good sense of development when it comes to full stack. Because we build the backend, as you can see here, this is not very user friendly, but we know that this is a powerful thing that we build because it's an API. But it would be nice if we can have the data presented like this in a nice UI. So that's what the goal is going to be. We're going to see if we can use this API that we build, so the backend API, and then see if we can build a UI like this where we present the information in a nice user friendly way. So I'm going to go ahead and open my terminal, and I'm going to use the ng command. So I'm going to say ng new, and then we're going to call this, let's call this patient app. Okay, so we're going to call it patient app. And just so you guys see what I'm doing here, so I'm using this command here. I already have the Angular CLI installed, by the way. So if you don't have it installed, you can go ahead and run this command. So npm install -g to install it globally, and then add Angular/CLI. But I already have it, so I'm not going to run this command. So I'm running this command here. So I'm creating a new project. So ng new, the name of the project, and then we're gonna cd into that project, and then run ng serve just so that we can see something. So let me bring back the terminal, and I'm gonna press enter here. So ng new, and then the name of the application. I'm gonna say yes on this question. Do we want to use routing? So I'm gonna say no, because we're only gonna have one page. And then css for my styling, and this is gonna take some time to just build the project and create everything. So I'll come back when this is over. So the CLI created the application for me, and you can see I'm navigated inside of the folder, and I can do an ls here so that you can see the files that were created. And what I'm gonna do is to just type code and a dot to open Visual Studio Code, and I'm gonna bring it over, and I'm gonna say trust and open it up. So you can see we have this boilerplate code here that was generated by the Angular CLI. And if I expand the source folder and expand the app folder, you can see they're using TS extension for these files, which means they're using TypeScript. You can see that they're using import, and everything is TypeScript. Now we're getting these errors because I haven't installed all the dependencies yet, and I'm gonna do that in a second. But you can see here they're using TypeScript. So the main file is a TypeScript file, it's not a JavaScript file. Polyfills is also a TypeScript file, and also the test file. So the spec file is a test file, and you can see here the extension is TS. So by default, Angular uses TypeScript, and that's why I chose it, just to show you a front-end application that's using TypeScript, since we already built a backend application. So to get rid of these errors, I'm gonna go ahead and run npm install. So I'm gonna bring back the terminal, and then npm and then press enter. So the dependencies have been installed, so I'm gonna do ng serve, and that should start the development server, and I'm gonna say yes on that and press enter. And this is gonna compile and then serve the application on localhost. And as you can see here, it's running on localhost 4200. So I'm gonna copy this, go back to the browser, and just paste this here. And you can see the application is running. So we have the application running. So now what we're going to need to do is to make HTTP request to request the data from this API that we built, and then present the data on the UI like this, so that you can see a front-end application using TypeScript. But again, it's going to be challenging to just talk about TypeScript and not talk about some of the Angular concept. It's just going to be hard to do because you need to understand certain things about Angular. But I'll try my best and explain everything to you guys. So I'm gonna go ahead and delete the spec file because we're not gonna be writing tests, so I don't want to keep this file at all. So I'm gonna delete it. And what we want to do, like I mentioned, is to make HTTP requests to the backend API. And to do this, there is a concept in Angular called service, where you put something that's gonna be shared among components. And usually an HTTP service or some service that's gonna make HTTP calls would be something that would be a service because you want to share it among different components in case they wanna use it. So I'm gonna open the terminal again, and then I'm gonna close this and clear the screen. And you can use the Angular CLI to generate a service. You can do it manually, but since we already have the CLI, then we're just gonna use it. And to do this, you do ng generate, or G for short, and then service. I think you can do S, but I'm not sure. And I want to put this into a service folder. So I'm going to say service, and then I'm going to call it patient. So that's going to be the patient service. And I'm going to press enter, and it's going to create some files for me. You can see here it created 2 files. So I'm going to minimize this. Actually, I'm going to run this. So ng serve, and then minimize it. And now if I go here, you can see we have this folder now called service. And again, delete the spec file because I'm not going to be dealing with tests. And inside of the service, then we can start writing function that's going to make the HTTP request. So that's one thing in Angular. So when you have one functionality or multiple different functionalities that you can group into one common functionality, and you want to be able to share this among different components, then you can create a service, and then you can inject the service, which is dependency injection in Angular. So Angular comes with its own HTTP client, and before we can use it, we have to import it in our module. And you can see here we're using the browser modules, and this is used to like render things on the UI. And now I'm gonna go ahead and import the HTTP client module. And I'm gonna go up here and see if I can import it. So we're gonna say import, and this is the HTTP client module. So HTTP client module. And this is supposed to come from Angular command / I think HTTP. So that is imported. You can see here we have the HTTP client module. So we can close that. And then here in the constructor, we can import the HTTP client. I'm going to inject it inside of the constructor. So I'm going to do private. I'm going to call it HTTP, and it's going to be of type HTTP client. And you can see it coming up here. Okay, so we're going to be using the HTTP client provided by Angular so that we can make HTTP requests. And what I want to do is to create a function so that I can call the API, and I'm going to call it get patients. Okay, so that's a good name for it because we're trying to get some patients. And for now, I'm going to make it return an observable because that's what it's going to return. And the observable is a generic. For now, I'm going to pass in any. Okay, so we're going to say it's going to return an observable of any. And then here, what we can do is to just return the HTTP client. So we're going to say this HTTP.get because we want to make a get request. And then here again, the get request is a generic. So we're going to say any for now. And then we're going to pass in the URL. So here in parentheses, we're going to pass in the URL. And this was http://192.168.1.160. And we want to go to 3000. And we want to go to / patients. Okay, so this is gonna request all the patients, and it's gonna return it as an observable. So now I'm gonna go back to the app component. So the app component that we see here, this is the component that is talking to this app component.html. So this HTML code is the code that we saw. So if I bring back the browser, all this code that we're seeing, it's coming from this HTML that I just showed you. So this code right here. So if we delete everything in here, for example, and then go back, the app is going to refresh, and you can see it's blank because we remove all the HTML markup. So let me go back to the code, and I'm going to go to the app component. So what we can do here, I can get rid of this title for now, is to inject the constructor. So we're going to say constructor, and then here we're going to do the same thing again. So we're going to do a dependency injection. So we're going to say private, and we want the patient service, and we're gonna give it the type, which is patient service. Okay, so we're injecting the patient service inside of this class so that we can use it. And we need opening and close here, and the errors went away. So now we can use this service because we injected inside of this app component, and then we can define variables that we can use inside of the app component.html because this app component.html is talking to this component. So the HTML is talking to this, and you can see it here as the template URL. So the app component.html, that's the template for this class. So whatever we define inside of this class, as long as they're not private, we can use them inside of this app component. So I'm going to close this and expand this a little. So I'm going to go ahead and define the patients that I want to work with. So I know that I'm going to get a bunch of patients. Actually, I'm going to get an HTTP response. Okay, I'm just going to call it HTTP response. I'm going to give it a type of any, and I'm going to give it a value of null. Okay, so to begin with, it's going to have a value of null. And then I want to implement on init. So we're going to say on init. Okay, so this is going to allow us to run some code after this component has been initialized. And I'm going to make sure I import it. So it's supposed to come from core, and we need now to implement this on init. So what this is going to do is whenever this component is done initializing, so whenever the page is loading and this is initialized, it's going to run the code that we have in here. And the code that we have in here is just to use this service and then call the function to get all the patients and then set this response to the response that we get from the API. So I'm going to remove this code and I'm going to do this, that patient service, that get patients. So this is going to return an observable. So we need to subscribe to it. So I'm going to say subscribe. And then in here, we're going to wait for the response. So the first thing we're going to get is the response. So I'm going to call it response. Oops. And when we get the response, we want to set this, that HTTP response equal to the response that we're going to get. Okay, so whatever response that we're going to get from the server, we're going to set our response to that response. And I need a comma here. And if we get an error, so we're going to say error, then we're going to log it on the console. So here for now, we're just going to say console.log and then pass in the error. So just so that we can see what happened. So now we can go back inside of the HTML and let's say we're going to have a div, for example, and inside of this div, we can have two curly braces. So we're going to say, actually, let me just go ahead and copy this because I don't want to make a mistake. So we're going to say HTTP response. And also I'm going to put a star and then ng if, because I want to make sure that this is not null. So I'm going to say ng if HTTP response, which means if it's not null, then show us something. For example, I know this is going to have a, let me check the API real quick. So the API is going to have a status code, or we can look at the message. So let's copy this and then go back and pass in the message. Okay, so if everything goes well, whenever we reload the page, we should see the message that says welcome or the patient were retrieved, since we're trying to access all the patients. So if we go here, we're actually reaching for the patients. So we should see something like patient retrieved. Let's go back and let's go back to here. And you can see if I zoom in a little, you see patient retrieves. So we know that we're getting the data. And if we go back to the code 1 second, and if we try to just look at the whole thing, so I'm going to put the whole HTTP response and then go back, you see that it's object. And there is a pipe that we can use in Angular so that we can see this as a JSON. So let's go back to the code and I'm going to put a pipe, which is this key on top of the enter key, and then you do JSON. So that's a pipe that's built into Angular and it allows you to JSONify any object that you have. So now if we go back, we can see the whole JSON object, which is the response that we got from the backend. So we get the status code, the HTTP status, the message, which is patient retrieve, and then the data, which is an array of all the patients that we have, and then we have the timestamp. So now if I go back to the code, all we have to do is to use this object and then loop through all of the patients and then show the patient's information. So let's go ahead and do that. So I went ahead and added the HTML markup for this page, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. So if we go back to the patient board, we have the patient board here. And if you're familiar with UI stuff, then you can already tell that this is using Bootstrap, and that's the framework that I'm using. And let's take a look at the code for this. So this is pretty simple. We're using the container, and then there's a contact list here, and then we're using this card here, and here's the button, and then we have another card, and then we have all these rows here. So those are cards, as you can see here, there are cards, and then we have a bunch of them. So I'm gonna collapse this, and then I'm just gonna delete all the other ones because we only need one, and then we're gonna loop through our data and then recreate all of these cards. So I'm gonna delete it all the way up to here and delete that last one and select this and delete. Okay, so we're gonna delete all these cards and only leave one because we're gonna be looping through all of them. So what we want to do now, if I expand this back up, we want to still have the if statement, and I'm gonna go ahead and just copy it from here and then put it on the container. Okay, so we're not going to try to display the container unless this HTTP response is not null. And then in this HTTP response, we're going to loop through. So we're going to come here because we want to duplicate this for as many times as we have patients. Expand it again. So here we're going to use ng4. So I'm going to put a tag. So I'm going to put an asterisk and then ng4 and then set it equal to. And here I'm going to say let patient of and then the HTTP response dot data. Okay, because we know the data is an array and we want to loop through this array. So now we can use this local variable and then access the first name, last name, email, etc. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy this name, and I'm gonna go to this h5 here. So here we have the first name and the last name. So I'm gonna replace this with double curly braces, and then I'm gonna access the patient that first underscore name. So the same way that we have it in the database, and I'm gonna do the same for the last name, so we can have the whole name of the patient. So I'm gonna copy this and then override the Smith, and then I'm gonna change this to last name. So LA and then save. So now if we go back, we should see all the patients that we have in the database because we're looping through all of them, as you can see we're doing here. So let's go back to the code and you can see we have the two patients that we entered. So we have Henry and Alexander. And those are the two patients that we have up here as well. As you can see here, we have Henry and then we have Alexander. So let's go back and fill out the rest of the information. So let's go back to the code and I'm just gonna copy this just for convenience and then come down here. I think this is the email, so I'm gonna remove this and then say email, and I think this is the phone, so we're gonna override this and change this to phone. So we're gonna say phone, and we have to do something here. I think this is the address, so I'm just gonna change this to the address even if it's not the address, because we just want to be able to see something. And then I'm gonna save and then go back, and you can see we have the information that we put in for these patients. So now we have to change the pictures. So let's go back here and you can see the picture is being set here. So what we can do is property binding. So we can come here, put a bracket, and then in here we can pass in the patient image URL. So I'm gonna say patient and then change this to image underscore URL. I think that's what we called it. And if I save this, and I don't need the curly braces, so I'm gonna remove them. And the reason I don't need the curly braces is because we're binding to the property itself by using the bracket. And that's also another Angular concept. So I don't want to get into too much Angular, but I do want to show you the app in action. So let's go back to the browser. And now you can see we have these two pictures for the two patients that we have. And I'm using the same pictures as you can see here. So the same pictures from the template that I got online, I'm using the same pictures. But you can see that the rest of the information is the information that we get into the database. So now I'm going to show you how we're going to improve this, because we're using TypeScript. But then if we go back to the code, you see that if we go back to the service for 1 second, you see we're using any here. So that's not really a good practice, as we talked about before, because you have to type everything as much as possible in TypeScript. And that's what I'm going to show you, because we don't want to leave the application like this. So let's go ahead and improve this application using all of the TypeScript skills that we learned throughout the course. So the first thing I want to do is to look at this data. So you can see here we're getting an HTTP response. Okay, so we know that the HTTP response is going to have all this information: status code, status, message, and then a data, which is going to be an array of patients, as you can see here. And we're going to have a timestamp, which is going to be a string. So I'm going to copy this, okay, and go back to the code, and I'm gonna go ahead and create another folder. So in the app folder, I'm gonna create a new folder. I'm gonna call it interface. Inside of there, I'm gonna create the HTTP response, or just response. So let's do new file. Let's do HTTP response.ts. Okay, that's a TS file. And then here I'm gonna do export interface, and let's call it let's say custom HTTP response, okay, because this is the custom HTTP response the backend is sending to us. And then I'm gonna paste everything, and I didn't mean to copy all this, so I'm gonna remove all the patients, remove all this. And what I want to do is to come up here, and I'm gonna collapse this from a room. So what I want to do, let me go down here. So we want to do status code, so let's delete this. So the status code is gonna be a number. So here we can see clearly it's a number, so we're gonna set it to a number. And then we're gonna have the HTTP status. So let me bring it back up, and that's gonna be a string. Okay, so you can see that this is a string, so we're gonna change this to a string. And then we're gonna have the message. I'm just gonna go ahead and type it out at this point. And then we're gonna have the data. For now, I'm gonna keep the data to any. We're gonna get back to that. And then we're gonna have the timestamp. So timestamp, which is gonna be a string. And then we can remove everything else. I was trying to copy, but I made a mess instead. So this is our interface, and let's format this a little. So the interface that we're gonna be mapping is this custom HTTP response. And we know that it's gonna have a status code, which is gonna be a number, status, which is gonna be a string, everything else is gonna be a string. The data, we're gonna get back to it in a second. So now I'm gonna go back again, and then I'm gonna create another interface. So here, I'm gonna create another interface, and I'm gonna call it patient.ts. Okay, so that's going to represent the patient. And then I'm going to go back again and expand this. And we know that the patient is going to be of this type. So copy this and then go back to the code. And I'm going to do again, Control B to collapse this, and then export interface. And then we're going to call this patient, and open and close, and I'm going to paste again. All right, that looks good. So the reason I named this custom HTTP response is because there's already an HTTP response in TypeScript, and I don't want to have a conflict. So I call it custom HTTP response, but the patient should be fine because I don't think there's anything called patient. And then I'm going to do Control F, and then I'm going to look for every double quote, and then I'm going to replace it with nothing. So I'm going to place nothing here and then press this button, and it removes all of the double quotes because I don't want them. So I'm going to close close this, and then I'm gonna give this type again. So the ID is gonna be a number. Oops. And we need semicolon, and then everything else is gonna be a string. So let me move this over. And we're just gonna pass in the type. So here, this is gonna be a string, and I'm gonna copy that and I'm gonna paste it here. So the last name as well, another string. The email is gonna be a string. Address is a string. Diagnose is a string. The phone number is also a string. So we're gonna put a string there. The status is a string. The date also a string. And the image URL, of course, this is a string. So we're mapping the response so that we can have intelligence in working with TypeScript. This is really important because you want to catch as many bugs as possible. And that's the whole point of TypeScript. And I'm going to go ahead and save this and format it one more time. So now I can go back to the response and say, instead of any, this is going to be an array of patients. So I'm going to say patient array, okay, because I know that's what it is. Okay, so if we go back one more time, you can see the data is an array because of the bracket, and then it's an array of patient. And we just mapped the patient. So let's go back to the code, and now we can use this HTTP response as our type. So I'm going to copy this, and I can close this and then go back to the service. So in the service, instead of any here, I'm going to select it and press Ctrl D and then pass in custom HTTP response, and also make sure this is imported. So import it from our interface folder. I also want to just put this somewhere else. So the base URL, I'm going to put it in here as a variable. So I'm going to say private read only because we're never going to change this, and I'm going to call it API. Let's do uppercase. So API underscore base underscore URL, and then set it equal to this string right here. Okay, so we're setting the URL so that we don't have to retype it every single time. We're not building a big application, but it's just good practice so that you know that you shouldn't do it like this. And actually, this is supposed to go inside of the environment variable, but it's good for now because we're not going to deploy this or anything. And then I can come here and then put a template literal. So I'm going to do backtick and then $, open and close, and then I can refer to this variable. So I'm going to say this that base URL, and then put a /, and then now we can pass in patients and delete this. All right, so that looks better. So the base URL and then /patients, that's where we're sending the request. And you can already see how this looks a lot better. So now we can go back to the component, and here, instead of setting this as any again, we can pass in, I want to pass in the HTTP response. So custom HTTP response, come back here, and then change this to response and make sure this is imported. And I'm gonna remove the assignment. Okay, now it's giving me an error because this is not set to anything, it's not initialized. So what I can do is I can say this can be an HTTP response, but from the beginning it's not gonna be that because it won't be set. And then I'm gonna say we can put null here or undefined. Okay, let's go with undefined. Okay, so we know that this response can be custom HTTP response or undefined because it's not being set here in case this code didn't run. So that TypeScript can understand that this can be undefined. So now if I scroll up and over this, you can see that it's a response of custom HTTP response. And another thing we can do is I'm actually going to put this in curly braces so that we can have multiple lines. So I'm going to put this down and then go to the end, put a semicolon, and then go to the next line. So what we can do, we can also access specific things on this. So for example, let's say I was only interested in the patients array. So I can say patients, and then I say this is of type patient and it's an array. Okay, so I can define this like this. I'm going to have to import this again. Import, and again I'm gonna say it's possible that this can be undefined. And if you don't want to have to do this undefined like this, remember I showed you guys in the ts.config. So in here you can see again they're using the strict, which is true. So I'm not gonna remove it, but I just want to show you there's a configuration for this. If you don't want this to be too strict, then you can edit the configuration, but I'm not gonna do that now. I'm just gonna put undefined so that TypeScript knows that this can be an array of patient or it can be undefined. But then what we can do is we can go into the response. So we can say something like this, that patients. So we know that this is gonna be an array, and then we can set it equal to the response that data, because we know that the data is also gonna be an array. So say that I was only interested in the patients, but you can see, like if I remove this data and I put a dot, you can see now we have intelligence. Okay, so if we pass something that we're not supposed to pass here, of course this is going to give us an error and we're going to catch it before we deploy the application. In JavaScript you won't have that because JavaScript is not type safe, but in TypeScript you will have this error. Then you would know that there's something wrong here and you will have to fix it. And that's the whole point of using TypeScript. So you would have to change this to, like, for example, data, because this is an array, so we have to set it to an array as well. So you can see how we have improved the application significantly because we're using TypeScript and we were able to create interfaces and then type everything. And now if we make a mistake, we can see the mistake clearly because TypeScript is going to catch it. So I just wanted to show you how you can, quickly build a front-end application and then show the information that we build in the backend and show it in a nice UI, because it's possible that you might build this API and then you give it to another developer, or you build it for some other developers to use. But this is not something that you're going to give to like a regular user. You have to give them something like this, something with a nice UI, and then they can work with. So I would say that you can take this further and then build the other functionalities. So the add patient functionality, the delete patient functionality, or another page where you can see the details of the patient. And that would be your assignment for this course. So you can take this further and see if you can build the rest of the functionalities, because we know that this API not only allows us to look at all the patients, but we can update, delete, and then retrieve one patient as well. So if you want to show one patient on one page with all the patient information, then you can go ahead and do that. So I would say that you can take this as an assignment, just build the rest of the functionalities that we have in the backend API, and then you can put them under the UI. So you would translate that into the UI for the user. And I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of this log here. So let's scroll over and then select everything and then comment everything out. So if we go back now, we should only see the board. So that's what I wanted to show you. Again, this is something that I really just wanted to give you a taste of what you would be doing really in the real world. It's possible that you might just have to build the backend API, but it's also possible that you're the full stack developer, then you have to build both the backend and the front end. I wanted to give you guys just a taste of what it looks like to build an entire application, both the backend and the front end. And again, the front end is not even deployed because you can see here we're running it on localhost, and I don't want to have to go through another deployment and then navigate too far away from TypeScript. But you are able to see that we significantly improved the application by using TypeScript, and I just wanted to show you that TypeScript is really powerful and it's a great front-end language whenever you want to build something. It's really, really very convenient, and once you start using it, you don't want to go back to JavaScript. And some other things that I did off screen because I didn't want to like bother you too much with some of the UI stuff. So if you go inside of the style.css, I put some styling here for the application. So these are the styles that I got from the online template where I get the template from, and also in the index file I put the CDN for like Bootstrap and this material thing that they're using for the icons. So these little icons that you see here, they're coming from this library right here. But again, I wanted to focus on the TypeScript part of things, so I didn't want to bother you too much with this, but I did want to show you how you can use TypeScript and then work on the front end as well, because we only build the backend API. And also one last thing I want to do just so that you guys can see this. So I'm going to console.log the response. So I'm going to say response just so that you can see it on the console, because I didn't do that. So if we go back here, the page is refreshed, go to inspect, go to console, and this is the object, and you can see that we get the response back, and we can expand this. We get the 2 patients in here and all the metadata with the response. So I hope that was helpful to you. And again, if you have questions when you try to build the other functionalities, just let me know. I can help you. Anybody can do it in any way that they want. It doesn't really matter as long as it works for your user experience. So I hope that was helpful to you, and thank you again for taking the course. Of course, if you have any questions, let me know. I would be happy to assist you. Thank you again, and happy coding.